They called him the Wolf of Blackthorne, a duke so dangerous that mothers warned their daughters to look away when his carriage passed. Tonight, Lady Elara Whitcombe would become his wife, sold like livestock to settle her father's debts. But what she would discover in the shadows of Blackthorne Manor would shatter everything London society believed about monsters, marriage, and the thin line between legend and truth. If you want to see how a woman brings England's most feared nobleman to his knees and discovers the shocking secret he's been hiding from the world, stay with us until the very end. And don't forget to hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. The rain hammered against the windows of Whitcombe House like fists demanding entry, each drop a reminder that some debts could not be washed away. Lady Elara Whitcombe stood motionless in the drawing room, her pale blue dress pristine against the storm's fury outside, while inside her chest, a different kind of tempest gathered strength. You will marry him, and that is final. Her father's voice cut through the room with the efficiency of a blade through silk, clean, decisive, irreversible. Lord Edmund Whitcombe stood by the fireplace, his back rigid as iron despite the slight tremor in his hands. Those hands had once lifted Elara onto her first pony, had applauded at her piano recitals, had wiped away her tears when her mother died. Now they shook with the weight of choices that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. "Father, please," Elara began, but he raised one hand, silencing her with a gesture perfected over 2 decades of absolute authority. "Do not speak. Listen." He turned slowly, and she saw in his face something that frightened her more than anger ever could. Resignation. Complete, hollow resignation. "The Duke of Blackthorne has agreed to assume all our debts. Every penny, Elara. The gambling losses, the failed investments, the loans I took from men who do not forgive. He will pay it all. In exchange, you will become his duchess." The word hung in the air between them like a noose. Duchess. 6 weeks ago, Elara had imagined her future as a watercolor painting. Soft edges, gentle colors, perhaps a kind husband who enjoyed books and long walks through Hyde Park. Marriage to a respectable gentleman of modest fortune. Children who would laugh freely. A life measured in quiet contentment rather than grand passion. That painting had been torn to shreds the moment Dominic Ravenscroft, Duke of Blackthorne, had walked into her father's study with an offer that was really a command dressed in negotiations clothing. "You're selling me," Elara said quietly, surprised at the steadiness in her own voice, like a horse at auction. "I am saving this family." Her father's control cracked, his voice rising to a shout that made the servants in the hallway pause their pretense of not listening. "Do you understand what happens if I refuse? They will take this house. Your brother will lose his commission. Your sister will never marry. No respectable family will align with ours once the scandal spreads. We will be ruined, Elara. Absolutely and completely ruined." He crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging in with desperate intensity. "I know what they say about him. I know the rumors. But he is a duke, child. He is wealthy beyond measure. He will protect you, provide for you, and in doing so he will save us all." Elara looked into her father's eyes and saw the truth he wasn't speaking aloud. He was terrified. Not just of poverty or scandal, but of the Duke himself. Of what kind of man offers to pay a fortune for a bride he's never properly met? "What if the rumors are true?" she whispered. Lord Whitcombe released her shoulders and turned away, unable or unwilling to answer. In the silence, Elara heard the answer clearly enough. It didn't matter if they were true. She was already promised. But the first time Elara saw Dominic Ravenscroft, she had expected a monster. What she got was somehow worse, a man so carefully controlled that he seemed carved from marble rather than born of flesh and blood. The meeting took place in her father's study 3 days after the arrangement had been finalized. Lord Whitcombe had insisted on proper protocol, as if tradition could somehow sanitize what amounted to a business transaction. Elara wore her finest afternoon dress, her hair arranged in careful curls, her hands folded demurely in her lap, playing the part of the obedient daughter one last time. When the Duke entered, the air in the room changed. There was no other way to describe it. One moment, Elara sat in familiar surroundings, her father's desk cluttered with correspondence, the faint smell of pipe tobacco, weak afternoon sunlight struggling through London's perpetual haze. The next moment, Dominic Ravenscroft filled the doorway, and suddenly, the room felt smaller, the air thicker, every sound sharper. He was not what she expected. The rumors painted him as either ancient and cruel or young and brutish, depending on which gossip one believed. The reality defied simple categorization. Dominic appeared to be in his early 30s, tall and lean, with the kind of build that suggested physical power kept carefully restrained. Dark hair, storm gray eyes that moved across the room with predatory assessment, strong features that would have been handsome if they weren't set in such cold composure. He wore black, almost entirely. Black coat, black waistcoat. The only contrast, a crisp white shirt and a silver watch chain. Even his presence felt dark. Not evil, but shadowed, like looking at something through smoke. Lord Whitcombe. His voice was cultured, educated, devoid of warmth. Lady Elara. He bowed, the gesture technically perfect and emotionally hollow. Elara rose and curtsied, her training taking over when her mind went blank. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tensed almost imperceptibly when her father began speaking. This was a man who listened to every word but trusted none of them. "Your Grace, may I present my daughter, Lady Elara Whitcombe," her father said with forced joviality that fooled no one. "Elara, His Grace, the Duke of Blackthorne, has graciously, we can dispense with the pleasantries." Dominic's interruption was soft but absolute. His gaze shifted to Elara, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing against her chest. "Lady Elara, I imagine you have questions." It was not what she expected. Lords of his rank did not invite interrogation from women they'd essentially purchased. They issued commands and expected compliance. She began, then stopped, unsure how to navigate this strange opening he'd offered. "You may speak freely," he said, and something flickered in those gray eyes. Not kindness, exactly, but perhaps acknowledgement. Recognition that she was trapped as surely as any creature in a snare. "I prefer honest conversation to polite fiction." Lord Whitcombe shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to control the dialogue, but Dominic raised one hand slightly, the same gesture her father had used on her days ago, and the older man fell silent. Elara drew a breath, made a choice, and spoke the truth. "Why me?" Practicality. No hesitation, no softening. "You are well-bred, educated, of appropriate age. Your family's circumstances make you available. And you have a reputation for discretion, which I value highly." "You mean I'm desperate enough to accept a monster?" The words escaped before she could stop them, and Lord Whitcombe made a strangled sound of horror, but Dominic's expression didn't change. If anything, a hint of something that might have been respect touched his features. "Is that what they told you I am?" he asked quietly. "A monster?" "They told me many things." Elara lifted her chin, feeling reckless fury building in her chest. If she was to be sold, at least let her speak plainly before she was silenced forever. "That you fought 7 duels and killed 3 men. That you ruined the Ashford family and drove them from England. That women who become involved with you end up destroyed. That you—" She faltered, the worst accusation catching in her throat. "That I murdered my father," Dominic finished for her, his voice flat. "Yes. They would tell you that." The confirmation hit her like cold water. Lord Whitcombe's face had gone pale, but Dominic's remained impassive, as if discussing the weather rather than patricide. "The rumors have reached even my ears, Your Grace," her father managed weakly. "Surely you understand Lady Elara's concern." "I understand perfectly." Dominic turned back to Elara, and now his gaze held something sharper. Challenge, perhaps, or calculation. "You wish to know if I am safe, if your father is trading your future for his debts only to deliver you into hell." "Yes," Elara said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. For a long moment, Dominic studied her with those unsettling gray eyes. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a terrible smile, cold and knowing, the expression of a man who had long ago stopped caring what others thought of him. "I will give you one truth, Lady Elara, and you may decide what to do with it." He stepped closer, and she forced herself not to retreat. "Every story you have heard about me contains a kernel of fact, wrapped in layers of fear and fabrication. I have fought duels, because men of certain temperaments believe insults must be answered with violence. I did financially destroy the Ashford family, because Lord Ashford attempted to blackmail me, and I do not respond well to threats. Women in my life have suffered because London society punishes any woman associated with a man like me, not because I harmed them directly. He paused, and his voice dropped lower, each word precise as a surgeon's cut. As for my father's death, yes, I was there when he died. And yes, I allowed the world to believe I was responsible. But the truth of that night is mine alone. I share it with no one. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bone. Lord Whitcombe looked like he might faint. Elara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she held Dominic's gaze, refusing to look away. "Then why should I marry you?" she asked. "Because I will never lie to you," Dominic said simply. "I will never strike you, betray you, or abandon you. I will give you wealth, protection, and freedom to live as you choose within the bounds of propriety. In exchange, I require only your name beside mine, your presence at necessary social functions, and your discretion regarding my private affairs." "You speak of marriage as a contract, Your Grace." "Because that is precisely what it is, Lady Elara." His tone gentled fractionally, the first hint of something approaching sympathy. "I do not offer you love. I do not pretend this arrangement is anything but what circumstances have made it. But I will honor every promise I make to you, which is more than most love matches can claim." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, a stunning piece of craftsmanship, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in silver that gleamed even in the study's dim light. "This was my grandmother's ring," he said, taking it from the box. "She was the last member of my family worth remembering. If you accept this, you accept the marriage. If you refuse—" He met her eyes, and for just an instant she saw something crack in his careful armor. Exhaustion, perhaps, or resignation. "If you refuse, I will walk out of this room, your father's debts will remain his burden, and you will never see me again." Lord Whitcombe made a choked sound, desperation naked on his face, but Dominic never looked away from Elara. The choice was not really a choice at all. They both knew it. Her family would be destroyed. Her siblings' futures obliterated. Everything her mother had built, every sacrifice her family had made, would crumble into scandal and ruin. But Dominic had offered her something in that moment, a sliver of agency, an acknowledgement that she had the power to refuse, even if that power was illusory. Elara extended her hand. Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger with surprising gentleness, his fingers warm against her cold skin. The sapphire caught the light, throwing blue shadows across her palm. "Then it is done," he said quietly. "We will marry in 4 weeks. Your father will provide a list of guests. I will handle all other arrangements." He released her hand and stepped back, the brief moment of connection severed as cleanly as if it had never existed. "I will call again in 3 days to discuss the settlement details." He bowed to them both, turned, and left the room without another word, his footsteps fading down the hallway like a retreating storm. Elara stared at the ring on her finger, beautiful, expensive, cold. "You did well, child," her father said, relief making his voice shake. "You did what was necessary." But Elara wasn't listening. She was remembering the way Dominic had looked at her in that final moment before the ring slid home, the way his fingers had trembled, just slightly, just enough to reveal that beneath all his terrible control, he was not quite as unaffected as he pretended. The monster, she realized, was also a man, and that made everything infinitely more dangerous. London society descended on the engagement like vultures on fresh carrion. Within 24 hours, the news had spread through every drawing room, gentlemen's club, and scandal sheet in the city. Lady Elara Whitcombe, unremarkable daughter of an increasingly desperate baron, had somehow captured the most eligible and terrifying bachelor in England. The reactions ranged from shock to pity to barely concealed schadenfreude. "Poor creature," Lady Pemberton stage whispered at a garden party 3 days after the announcement, her voice pitched perfectly to carry across the lawn. "Sacrificed on the altar of her father's gambling debts. Mark my words, she'll be a widow within a year, or wish she were." Her companions tittered nervously, stealing glances at Elara, who sat beneath a rose arbor pretending to read. The book in her hands might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all she comprehended. Every word on the page blurred together, replaced by the endless loop of speculation running through her mind. What had she agreed to? More importantly, what had she not been told? Her closest friend, Charlotte Fairfax, appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of lemonade and a fierce expression. "Ignore them," she said, sitting down hard enough to make the bench creak. "They're jealous." "Jealous?" Elara managed a weak laugh. "Of what? My upcoming marriage to a man rumored to have killed his own father?" "Of the fact that you'll be a duchess," Charlotte said bluntly. She was the daughter of a successful merchant, wealthy but untitled, and had no patience for false modesty. "Of your £30,000 settlement, of the Blackthorne estates, the London house, the jewels. Half these women would sell their souls to be in your position, rumors and all." "Then they're welcome to it." Charlotte's expression softened. She set down the lemonade and took Elara's hand, careful not to dislodge the sapphire ring that had become both a symbol and a shackle. "Are you frightened?" "Terrified," Elara admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Charlotte, what if it's all true? What if he truly is everything they say?" "Then you'll handle it." Charlotte squeezed her fingers. "You're stronger than you think, Elara. You've managed your father's household since you were 16. You've kept your family together through your mother's death and your brother's scandals. You are not some fragile flower who will wilt at the first sign of difficulty." "This isn't managing a household budget or mediating between servants," Elara said. "This is marriage to a man who may have committed murder." "May have," Charlotte emphasized. "That's all anyone truly knows. Speculation and rumor. No charges were ever brought, no investigation concluded guilt. Perhaps the truth is less dramatic than the gossip." But even as she spoke, they both heard the whispers floating across the garden. "They say he keeps his last mistress's letters locked in a tower room. Found his father at the bottom of the stairs with a broken neck. Once challenged a man to a duel over a spilled drink. Can you imagine?" "She doesn't know what she's walking into." Elara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 100 gazes measuring her, pitying her, already writing her obituary in their minds. That night, alone in her bedroom, she received the first warning. It arrived as a letter, delivered by a nervous maid who claimed a hooded figure had pressed it into her hands outside the kitchen entrance. No name, no seal, just her name written in elegant script across expensive paper. Elara's hand shook as she opened it. "Lady Elara, you do not know me, but I know your future husband intimately. I write to you now as one woman to another, in hopes that you might still escape what I could not. 5 years ago, I was in your position, young, naive, flattered by the Duke of Blackthorne's attention. He courted me with pretty words and expensive gifts. He promised me the world. I believed him. I was wrong. Dominic Ravenscroft is not a man. He is a void dressed in human skin. He takes what he wants and discards what he doesn't with the same cold efficiency. When I told him I carried his child, he looked at me as if I were an inconvenience to be managed. He paid me to disappear, gave me enough money to leave London and never speak his name again. I took the money. I had no choice. The child, a son, died before his first birthday. I have lived in exile ever since, watching from a distance as Dominic continues his life untouched by consequence. You still have time to refuse him, Lady Elara. Whatever debts bind your family, they are nothing compared to the price you will pay as his wife. He will consume you, and when he is finished, there will be nothing left but the hollow shell of who you once were. Run, while you still can. A friend who wishes you well." Elara read the letter 3 times, each word sinking into her mind like stones into still water, creating ripples of doubt that spread wider with each reading. A child. A mistress paid to disappear. Cold, calculated cruelty. She thought of Dominic's face when he'd slipped the ring onto her finger, the careful control, the absence of emotion. Had he looked at this other woman the same way? Had he promised her honesty too, only to destroy her when she became inconvenient? Sleep evaded her that night. She lay in the darkness, staring at the sapphire ring catching moonlight, and wondered if she was about to make the greatest mistake of her life. The second warning came 5 days later at a dinner party hosted by the Duke of Marlborough. Elara had attended reluctantly, knowing that as Dominic's fiancée, she would now be invited to events previously far above her family's social standing. The Marlborough house glittered with wealth, crystal chandeliers throwing rainbow light across marble floors, liveries servants moving with choreographed precision, guests dressed in silks and jewels that cost more than Elara's family earned in a year. She felt like an imposter in her simple green gown, even though Charlotte had assured her she looked lovely. Dominic was not in attendance. Apparently he rarely accepted social invitations, which only fed the speculation about his character. Elara found herself both relieved and disappointed by his absence. Part of her had hoped to observe him in society, to gauge his behavior when not playing the role of her stern future husband. Instead, she navigated the evening alone, smiling politely at congratulations that felt more like condolences, accepting glasses of champagne she barely touched, counting the minutes until she could reasonably depart. Then Lord Ashton appeared at her elbow. "Lady Elara," he said, his smile too wide, too friendly. "Might I have a word in private?" Everything in Elara's instincts screamed refusal, but Lord Ashton was a respected member of Parliament, a man whose opinion carried weight in government circles. Refusing him would be remarked upon, speculated about. She allowed him to guide her to a small library off the main hallway, telling herself she was being foolish, that nothing could happen in a house full of guests with the door left properly ajar. Lord Ashton closed the door. "That's not appropriate," Elara began, but he raised a hand, his expression turning serious. "Forgive the breach of protocol, but what I have to tell you cannot be overheard." He moved to the window, putting distance between them, and suddenly he looked older, tired. "You're making a terrible mistake, Lady Elara. I feel it my duty to warn you before it's too late." "My lord, I don't think—" "Dominic Ravenscroft destroyed my family," Lord Ashton said bluntly. "Not with violence or scandal, but with something far more insidious, calculated, methodical ruination. 5 years ago, my younger brother made an error in judgment. He spread a rumor about the Duke, something foolish and ultimately harmless. Boys being boys, you understand." He turned to face her, and his eyes held genuine pain. Dominic did not challenge him to a duel. He did not confront him publicly. Instead, he systematically dismantled every aspect of my family's business. He called in loans we didn't know he held. He spread counter-rumors that destroyed my brother's reputation. He manipulated markets until our investments collapsed. Within 6 months, we were forced to sell our estate just to cover our debts. Lord Ashton's voice hardened. My brother hanged himself in his bedroom. He was 23 years old, and the Duke of Blackthorne never once showed remorse. He attended the funeral with that cold, impassive expression, as if he'd merely stepped on an insect and moved on with his day. Elara felt ice forming in her stomach. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you still have time," Lord Ashton said urgently. "Break the engagement. Claim illness, incompatibility, anything. I have connections, Lady Elara. I can help your family find other solutions to their financial difficulties. You don't have to sacrifice yourself to that monster." "He said," Elara began, then stopped, unsure how much to reveal. "The Duke claimed your family attempted to blackmail him." Lord Ashton's face flushed with anger. "Of course he would say that. It's what he does. He twists truth until he's the victim, and everyone else is the villain. There was no blackmail. There was only a stupid boy's foolish words and a powerful man's disproportionate revenge." He crossed the room and gripped her hands, his intensity frightening in its desperation. "Please, Lady Elara. I failed to protect my brother, but perhaps I can save you. Dominic Ravenscroft leaves destruction in his wake. Don't become another casualty of his cruelty." Before Elara could respond, the door opened. Dominic stood in the doorway. He wore evening dress, perfectly tailored, his expression utterly calm. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes fixed on Lord Ashton with the kind of focused attention a cat gives a mouse before the killing strike. "Lord Ashton," he said softly, "I wasn't aware you'd been invited this evening." "Your Grace." Lord Ashton released Elara's hands and stepped back, though he kept his chin raised defiantly. "I was merely offering your fiancé some friendly advice." "How considerate." Dominic moved into the room with that predatory grace Elara was beginning to recognize. He positioned himself between her and Lord Ashton, protecting or claiming, she couldn't tell which. Though I wonder at the propriety of closeting yourself alone with an engaged woman to offer such advice. I wonder at the propriety of many things, Your Grace, Lord Ashton shot back, including men who destroy families and feel no shame. The temperature in the room plummeted. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness suggested a coiled spring pulled to breaking point. You should leave, Dominic said, his voice carrying absolute authority. Now. I'll leave when Lady Elara asks me to leave. Both men turned to her, and Elara realized with a jolt that this moment mattered, that how she responded would set a precedent for her entire future. If she sided with Lord Ashton, she rejected Dominic publicly, added fuel to every rumor swirling around him. If she sided with Dominic, she aligned herself with a man who might truly be everything they claimed. She thought of the letter from the mysterious woman. She thought of Lord Ashton's dead brother. She thought of all the whispered warnings, the pitying glances, the certainty in everyone's eyes that she was walking toward her doom. Then she thought of Dominic's trembling fingers as he'd slid the ring onto her hand, the way he'd offered her the choice to refuse, even knowing what it would cost her, the careful honesty in his voice when he'd said, I will never lie to you. Lord Ashton, she said quietly, I appreciate your concern, but my future is my own to determine. I would like you to leave now. Lord Ashton's face crumpled with disappointment and frustration. You're making a mistake. Perhaps, Elara said, but it will be my mistake to make. He left without another word, brushing past Dominic with barely concealed hostility. The door closed, leaving Elara alone with her future husband in the sudden, crushing silence. You heard everything, she said. It wasn't a question. I was looking for you, Dominic replied. When I saw Ashton guide you away from the party, I followed. He moved to the sideboard and poured himself a drink, brandy, by the amber color, and downed it in one swallow. I assume he told you about his brother. He did. And what did you conclude? Elara studied him, the rigid line of his shoulders, the careful way he set the glass down, avoiding her gaze. I concluded that I don't know the truth. I only know what people tell me, and everyone seems to have a different version. The truth is complicated, Dominic said, more complicated than Lord Ashton's grief will allow him to see. Then explain it to me. He finally looked at her, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she would ask rather than assume. Ashton's brother didn't just spread a rumor. He attempted to extort money from me by threatening to publicize certain private correspondence, letters that would have damaged someone I cared about, someone innocent. Your mother? Elara guessed. Dominic's eyes widened fractionally, the first genuine surprise she'd seen on his face. How did you... You said your grandmother was the last family member worth remembering, but you didn't include your mother in that statement, which suggests complex feelings, and you allowed the world to believe you killed your father rather than... What? Reveal something about her? For a long moment, Dominic just stared at her, and Elara wondered if she'd overstepped, revealed too much of the analysis she'd been conducting in private. Then he smiled. A real smile this time, small and fleeting, but genuine. You're more observant than I expected, Lady Elara. You're more human than you pretend to be, Your Grace. The smile faded, replaced by that familiar guarded expression. But something had shifted in the room. Some wall cracked just enough to let through a sliver of light. The truth of my father's death is mine to share or keep as I choose, Dominic said carefully. But I will tell you this. I was present when he died, and I do not mourn him. Everything else is speculation. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. Elara made a choice, perhaps a foolish one, certainly a dangerous one. Then I won't ask you about it again. When you're ready to tell me, you will. Until then, I'll judge you by what I see, not what others claim. Why? The question burst from him with surprising force. Why would you give me that courtesy when everyone else has condemned me? Because, Elara said slowly, working through the realization even as she spoke it, I think you're protecting someone. And I think that protection has cost you dearly. A truly cruel man wouldn't pay that price. Dominic closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Elara saw something that made her breath catch. Vulnerability, raw and quickly shuddered, but there for just an instant. "We should return to the party," he said, his voice rougher than before. "People will talk if we remain absent too long." "People will talk regardless," Elara pointed out. "We could burn down London, and they'd still speculate about our sins." That surprised a laugh out of him, short and rusty, as if he hadn't practiced the sound in years. "True enough." He offered his arm, the gesture formal, but the fingers that brushed hers holding just a hint of warmth. "Shall we, Lady Elara?" She took his arm, and together they returned to the glittering party, to the stares and whispers and barely concealed judgment. But something had changed. She could feel it in the solid strength of his arm beneath her fingers, in the way he positioned himself subtly between her and the most hostile gazes, in the quiet pride in his voice when he introduced her as "my fiancée" to those brave enough to approach. The monster of London's imagination was beginning to look more like a man carved from ice by years of loneliness and suspicion. And Elara realized with a mixture of terror and fascination that she wanted to see what lay beneath that frozen surface, even if it destroyed her in the process. The third warning arrived on the morning of her final dress fitting, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He appeared at the kitchen door just after dawn, handed the sealed envelope to the cook, and vanished into London's fog before anyone could question him. Elara found it on her breakfast tray, nestled between the teacup and the toast rack like a serpent coiled among roses. She knew what it was before she opened it, another voice from Dominic's past, another attempt to save her from herself. Part of her wanted to burn it unread, to prove that she'd made her choice and wouldn't be swayed by anonymous accusations. But curiosity and fear proved stronger than defiance. She broke the seal. "Lady Elara, I am the Duke of Westmont. We have not met, but I served with the late Duke of Blackthorne, Dominic's father, in Parliament for 15 years. I write to you now as a friend of that honorable man, and in his memory, I must speak truth. The current Duke murdered his father. I do not deal in speculation or rumor. I state this as fact. I was among those who examined the circumstances of the old Duke's death. The official conclusion was accidental fall, but those of us who knew both men understood the reality. The elder Duke was a strong, vigorous man in his prime. He did not simply tumble down stairs like a clumsy child. He was found at the base of the North Tower staircase at Blackthorne Manor, his neck broken, on a night when only 3 people were present in that isolated wing: the Duke, his wife, and their son Dominic. The Duchess claimed she found him already fallen, but servants reported hearing terrible arguments that evening, shouting that shook the walls. Dominic was 19 years old, wild and temperamental, constantly at odds with his father's discipline. The magistrate was persuaded to rule the death accidental. The Ravencroft influence is considerable, as you are learning, but those of us who love the old Duke know his son killed him, whether by direct violence or by provoking him to his death. You are marrying a patricide, Lady Elara. A man capable of killing his own father is capable of anything. I implore you to reconsider before it is too late. Some stains cannot be washed away, no matter how much wealth or title attempts to cover them. Richard Thornberry, Duke of Westmont. This letter was different from the others, signed, traceable, written by a man of significant rank and reputation. Not some scorned lover or embittered enemy, but a duke himself, a member of Parliament, someone whose word carried weight in the highest circles of power. Elara's hands trembled as she read it a second time, then a third. The words burned themselves into her mind with cruel clarity. A man capable of killing his own father is capable of anything. She thought of Dominic's carefully controlled demeanor, the ice in his gray eyes, the way violence seemed to coil beneath his surface like a spring compressed too long. She thought of his admission. I was present when he died, and I do not mourn him. What if the Duke of Westmont was right? What if she'd convinced herself to see complexity where there was only cold-blooded murder? Miss? Her maid Sarah appeared in the doorway, concern creasing her young face. Are you unwell? You've gone quite pale. Elara folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. I'm fine. Just wedding nerves. But she wasn't fine. She was drowning in doubt, suffocating under the weight of decisions she couldn't unmake and truths she couldn't verify. The wedding was 5 days away. The dress fitting took place in the elegant shop of Madame Leclerc, London's most sought-after modiste. The gown was a masterpiece, ivory silk with delicate lace overlay, seed pearls sewn in patterns that caught light like captured starlight, a train that would flow behind her like a river of moonlight. It should have made her feel like a bride. Instead, she felt like a sacrifice being adorned for the altar. Charlotte attended with her, along with Elara's younger sister Caroline, who chattered excitedly about the wedding breakfast and the guest list, and whether the prince himself might attend. Caroline was 17, still young enough to see romance in an arrangement that had none. "You'll be the most beautiful duchess in England," Caroline said, her eyes wide with admiration as Elara stood on the fitting platform, while Madame Leclerc's assistants made minute adjustments to the hem. "Everyone will be so jealous. Or relieved it's not them," Charlotte muttered, earning a sharp look from Caroline. "Don't be cruel. The Duke is terribly handsome, and he's been nothing but generous to our family." Caroline touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from Dominic, sent the previous week along with gifts for every member of Elara's family. "I think it's romantic. A powerful Duke sweeping in to save us all." Elara met Charlotte's eyes in the mirror and saw her own skepticism reflected back. Charlotte knew about the letters. Elara had shared them in whispered conversations when her family wasn't listening. Charlotte knew the truth. This wasn't romance. It was transaction dressed in silk and pearls. "Has he called on you recently?" Charlotte asked carefully, changing the subject as Madame Leclerc pinned a section of lace. "Yesterday afternoon," Elara said. "We discussed the wedding timeline and the arrangements for moving my belongings to Blackthorne House." "How very passionate," Charlotte said dryly. "We also walked in Hyde Park for nearly 2 hours," Elara added, surprising herself with the defensiveness in her tone. "We discussed literature and philosophy. He's remarkably well-read." "The monster reads," Charlotte said, but her voice held less mockery than curiosity. "What else have you learned about him?" What had she learned? That Dominic preferred brandy to wine. That he wrote every morning at dawn, alone. That he'd read every book in his library at least once and could quote passages from memory. That he listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, every word carried weight. That sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression softened into something that might have been loneliness or longing, but vanished the moment their eyes met. "I've learned he's complicated," Elara said finally. "More complicated than the rumors suggest." "Complicated is a generous word for a man accused of murder," Charlotte pointed out. Before Elara could respond, the shop door opened with enough force to set the bell jangling violently. A woman swept in. 30 years old, perhaps, beautiful in a brittle way, dressed in expensive but slightly outdated fashion. Her eyes scanned the shop until they landed on Elara, and something predatory flashed across her features. "So you're the lamb," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent shop. "The sacrificial virgin being fed to the wolf." Madame Leclerc stepped forward, her French accent thickening with indignation. "Madame, this is a private fitting. You cannot simply—" "I can do whatever I please." The woman ignored the modiste completely, her attention fixed on Elara with unnerving intensity. "I'm Lady Victoria Ashford. Does that name mean anything to you, Lady Elara?" Elara's stomach dropped. Ashford, the family Dominic had destroyed according to Lord Ashton. The family whose youngest son had hanged himself. "I know the name," Elara said carefully, stepping down from the platform despite Madame Leclerc's protests about pins. "I'm sorry for your family's losses." "Sorry?" Lady Victoria laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You're sorry? You're about to marry the man who killed my brother-in-law, and you offer me sorry?" Caroline gasped. Charlotte moved protectively closer to Elara, but Elara held up a hand, stopping her. "I heard about your brother-in-law's death," Elara said, keeping her voice steady, though her heart raced. "It was a tragedy, but I was told there were complications, attempted blackmail." "Blackmail?" Lady Victoria's face flushed with rage. "Is that what he told you? That dear boy tried to defend our family's honor after your precious Duke spread vicious lies about us. James tried to make him stop, and Dominic Ravencroft destroyed him for it, systematically, deliberately. He took a young man's foolish mistake and used it as an excuse to obliterate everything we'd built." She advanced on Elara, and Charlotte stepped between them, but Lady Victoria's words kept coming like arrows seeking their target. Do you know what it's like to watch your family crumble? To see your husband broken by loss? To attend a funeral for a boy who should have had decades ahead of him? That is what your future husband does, Lady Elara. He finds weakness, and he exploits it until nothing remains but ash and grief. I think you should leave, Charlotte said firmly, but Lady Victoria ignored her. Look at me, she commanded, and something in her voice compelled Elara to meet her eyes. Look at what loving someone who crossed Dominic Ravencroft has cost me. I was beautiful once, truly beautiful, not this hollowed-out shell. I had a happy marriage. I had hope. He took all of it. Tears streamed down her face now, ruining carefully applied cosmetics, revealing the depth of pain beneath her fury. You think you can tame him? You think you can be the exception? You're not. You're just the latest victim in his collection. And when he's finished with you, there won't be enough left to bury. That's enough. Madame Leclerc finally found her courage and called for her assistants. 2 large men appeared from the back room, tailors by their measuring tapes and chalk-marked hands, and moved toward Lady Victoria. But she was already turning toward the door, her energy spent, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. At the threshold, she looked back one last time. I came here to save you, she said quietly, all the anger drained away, leaving only weary sadness. Because no one saved me. But I see now that you're already lost, just like the rest of us. She left, and the shop fell into stunned silence. Elara stood frozen, still wearing her wedding gown, feeling the weight of silk and lace, and accumulated accusations pressing down on her like stones. Don't listen to her, Caroline said quickly, her voice high and frightened. She's clearly mad with grief. The Duke would never— Wouldn't he? Elara heard herself ask. How do we know what he would or wouldn't do? We know nothing about him except what he chooses to show us. You knew that when you accepted his proposal, Charlotte said gently. This isn't new information, Elara. It's just louder. But it was new in a way. Before, the warnings had been abstract, letters from anonymous sources, stories from people she'd never met. This was different. This was a woman standing in front of her, devastation written in every line of her face, bearing witness to Dominic's capacity for destruction. I need air, Elara said abruptly. I need to think. She changed back into her day dress with fumbling fingers, barely hearing Madame Leclerc's assurances that the gown would be ready in time, that everything would be perfect, that all brides experience doubts. This wasn't doubt. This was drowning. She found herself walking without clear destination, Charlotte and Caroline trailing behind her, through streets she barely recognized. London flowed around her, vendors calling their wares, carriages clattering past, the endless press of humanity going about their lives while hers spiraled toward a point of no return. Where are we going? Caroline asked, slightly breathless from trying to keep up. Elara didn't answer because she didn't know. Her feet carried her forward while her mind churned through everything she'd learned, every warning, every glimpse of the man behind the reputation. She thought of Dominic's careful courtesy toward her, the way he'd never touched her beyond what propriety required. The surprising gentleness when he'd slipped the ring onto her finger. But she also thought of Lord Ashton's dead brother, of the woman claiming Dominic had paid her to disappear, of his own admission that he'd been present when his father died and didn't mourn him. What was the truth, and how was she supposed to discern it when everyone who knew seemed to have contradictory versions? Elara, stop! Charlotte caught her arm, pulling her to a halt in front of an unfamiliar townhouse. You can't just wander London in a daze. Talk to me. I don't know what to say. Elara heard the desperation in her own voice. I don't know what's real anymore. Everyone paints him as either a monster or a misunderstood victim, and I'm supposed to marry him in 5 days, and I don't know which version is true. Maybe both, Charlotte said. Maybe neither. Maybe he's just a complicated man who's made both good and terrible choices, like most people. Most people don't leave trails of destroyed families behind them. No, Charlotte agreed, but most people also don't pay £30,000 to save a family they've never met from financial ruin. That stopped Elara's spiraling thoughts. Charlotte was right. For all the accusations of cruelty, Dominic had shown her nothing but careful respect. He'd offered her agency when he could have simply claimed her like property. He'd been honest about the transactional nature of their arrangement rather than coding it in false romance. "I need to speak with him," Elara said suddenly. "I need to hear his version, not speculation from others, his truth." "Are you sure that's wise?" Caroline asked nervously. "It's improper to visit a gentleman unchaperoned and—" "I'm marrying him in 5 days," Elara interrupted. "Propriety is somewhat secondary at this point." Charlotte grinned. "Now that's the Elara I know. Come on then. Let's go confront your monster and demand answers." Blackthorne House sat in one of London's most prestigious squares, a massive Georgian structure of pale stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Elara had never visited before. All their meetings had taken place at her family's more modest home or in public spaces. Now, standing before the imposing entrance, she felt the weight of what this place represented. This would be her home. These rooms would contain her future. Behind these walls lived the man she'd agreed to spend her life with, and she barely knew him. The butler who answered her knock looked startled. Clearly unexpected visitors weren't common at Blackthorne House. "Lady Elara Whitcombe to see His Grace," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "It's urgent." "His Grace is not receiving visitors this afternoon, my lady," the butler said apologetically. "If you would care to leave a card, tell him I'm here about his father's death," Elara said, the words escaping before her caution could stop them. "Tell him if he doesn't see me now, I walk away from this marriage. He has 5 minutes to decide." The butler's eyes widened, but he stepped aside, allowing her into the entrance hall. "Please wait here, my lady." Charlotte and Caroline clustered close to Elara in the cavernous space, all marble floors and dark wood paneling, with portraits of stern-faced Ravencroft ancestors glaring down at them. The house felt cold despite the spring weather, as if warmth had been banished along with joy. 3 minutes later, the butler returned. "His Grace will see you in his study. Your companions may wait in the drawing room." "I'm going alone," Elara said, and before Charlotte could protest, she followed the butler up a curving staircase to the second floor. The study was exactly what she'd imagined: floor-to-ceiling books, a massive desk, leather chairs by the fire, everything precise and ordered and devoid of personal touches. Dominic stood by the window, still as stone, silhouetted against the gray London afternoon. He didn't turn when she entered. "You threatened to walk away," he said quietly. "I assume you mean it." "I do." "Then why are you here? Why not simply send a note canceling the arrangement?" "Because I want to hear the truth from you." Elara moved deeper into the room, her courage building with each step. "Not rumors, not speculation, your truth. About your father, about the Ashford family, about the woman claiming you abandoned her and your child." Dominic finally turned, and his expression was unreadable. "And if my truth confirms everything you fear, if I am the monster they claim, then I walk away knowing I gave you a chance to explain." He studied her for a long moment, those gray eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. Then he crossed to a cabinet, poured 2 glasses of brandy, and held one out to her. "Sit," he said. "This will take time." Elara took the glass and settled into one of the leather chairs, feeling the solid weight of it beneath her, grounding her. Dominic remained standing, staring into the fire as if finding his words in the flames. "My father was not a good man," he began, his voice flat and emotionless. "He was charming in public, respected in Parliament, admired for his wealth and position. Behind closed doors, he was a tyrant who ruled through fear and violence." He paused, and Elara saw his jaw clench, the only sign of emotion breaking through his control. "He beat my mother regularly, for perceived disobedience, for imagined slights, sometimes for no reason at all except that he could. She bore it in silence because that's what women of her generation were taught to do. Endure, survive, protect the family name above all else." "The night he died," Dominic continued, his voice dropping lower, "I was 19 years old, home from university. I heard my mother screaming. I ran to the tower staircase and found him attacking her, his hands around her throat, her face already turning blue." He looked at Elara now, and she saw in his eyes something she'd never seen before: raw, unhealed pain. "I pulled him off her. We fought. He was strong, furious, beyond reason. He came at me, and I pushed him away. He stumbled backward, lost his footing, fell down the stairs. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to stop her heart. "I watched him fall," Dominic said. "Watched him hit the landing, heard his neck break, and I felt nothing but relief that he couldn't hurt her anymore." "Your mother," Elara whispered. The official report said, "She claimed she found him already fallen," Dominic finished, "to protect me. She wrote a confession, explaining everything, then locked it away. She made me promise never to reveal the truth, never to tarnish her memory by admitting she'd married a monster and stayed with him for 20 years. He moved to his desk and opened a locked drawer, removing a bundle of yellowed letters tied with black ribbon. "This is her confession, her handwriting, her seal, every detail of every beating, every threat, every terror-filled night, and her final statement that she would swear before anyone that her husband's death was an accident, that I had nothing to do with it, even though she knew I did." He held the bundle out to Elara. "Read it if you wish. It's the truth the Duke of Westmont doesn't know. The truth I've protected for 13 years because honoring my mother's memory matters more to me than my own reputation." Elara took the letters with shaking hands, feeling the weight of them, not just the physical pages, but the accumulated pain and secrets they contained. "Why tell me this now? Why not let me walk away?" "Because you asked," Dominic said simply. "And because if we marry, you deserve to know what kind of man I truly am. I killed my father to save my mother's life. I allowed the world to believe I'm a monster to protect her honor. Everything else, the duels, the destroyed families, the discarded lovers, has its own truth, equally complicated." He sat heavily in the chair across from her, exhaustion clear in every line of his body. "Lady Victoria Ashford visited you today. I know, my staff informed me. Her version of events is accurate from her perspective. Her brother-in-law did try to blackmail me. He threatened to publish forged letters claiming my mother had been having an affair, that I was illegitimate, that the Ravencroft title was built on lies." "Was any of it true?" Elara asked. "No, but the scandal alone would have destroyed her reputation posthumously. I couldn't allow that." His voice hardened. "So yes, I used every resource at my disposal to stop him, and when he persisted, I made sure he couldn't hurt anyone again. I didn't anticipate he would take his own life. That is a guilt I carry every day." He met her eyes, and she saw the truth in them. Not innocence, but the burden of choices made in impossible circumstances. "The woman who claims I abandoned her and our child," he continued, "her name is Margaret Thornley. We had an arrangement 5 years ago. Nothing romantic, purely financial. She was an actress fallen on hard times. I paid for her lodging and expenses in exchange for her companionship at certain events where I needed to appear less isolated." "She became pregnant," Elara guessed. "She claimed she was," Dominic corrected. "I gave her money to leave London and start a new life, as she requested. I later heard the child died, but I never confirmed it. For all I know, there never was a child. Margaret was an actress, Elara, a skilled performer who knew how to play a role." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I am not innocent. I have made ruthless choices. I have hurt people to protect those I loved. But I have never struck a woman, never abandoned a child, never killed anyone except in self-defense of myself or someone helpless." "Why doesn't anyone know this?" Elara asked. "Why not tell the truth and clear your name?" "Because the truth requires exposing my mother's abuse and my father's cruelty. It requires admitting that the respected Duke of Blackthorne was a monster behind closed doors. It requires dragging her memory through scandal and speculation." His voice broke slightly. "She endured decades of hell to protect our family's name. The least I can do is endure society's judgment to protect hers." Elara looked down at the letters in her hands, then back at Dominic's face. No longer the cold, controlled mask, but something rawer, more human. She saw the 19-year-old boy who'd killed his father to save his mother. She saw the man who'd spent 13 years carrying that secret alone. And she made her choice. "I'll marry you," she said quietly. "Not because I have to, but because I choose to." Dominic's eyes widened. "You believe me?" "I believe you," Elara confirmed. "Or more accurately, I believe that your version is no more or less true than any other version I've heard. But yours is the only one that explains the man I've seen, the one who is careful with me, who keeps his promises, who values loyalty and honor above reputation. She stood and placed the letters on his desk. Keep your mother's secret. I won't ask about it again. But from this moment forward, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that we will be honest with each other. That in our marriage, we won't have secrets that could destroy us. That we'll be partners, not just names signed on a contract. Dominic rose and crossed to her, moving slowly as if approaching something fragile. He took her hands in his, the first time he'd initiated such contact, and his fingers were warm, solid, trembling slightly. I promise, he said, and she heard the weight of that vow in his voice. No more secrets between us, no more protecting you from truths you deserve to know. Then we have an agreement, Elara said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice when her heart raced. A real one, not just a transaction. For the first time since she'd met him, Dominic smiled. A genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face from stone to something almost beautiful. A real agreement, he echoed, between equals. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture courtly but the warmth behind it utterly sincere. Thank you, Elara, for giving me a chance when no one else would. Thank me after the wedding, she said with a small smile. I might still run screaming. That surprised a laugh from him, real and free, the sound filling the cold study with unexpected warmth. If you do, I promise not to chase you, at least not immediately. They stood there, hands clasped, something fragile and new forming between them. Outside, London continued its endless noise. But inside this room, for just a moment, there was only truth and tentative trust. And Elara realized with a jolt of recognition that somewhere in the past weeks, between the warnings and the whispers and the terrible weight of decision, she had started to care about this complicated, damaged, fiercely loyal man. It terrified her. But she didn't let go of his hands. Not immediately. Not when Charlotte appeared at the study door moments later, her face tight with concern, and questions Elara wasn't ready to answer. Not when the butler coughed discreetly, reminding them that propriety still existed even if they'd both chosen to ignore it. And not when Dominic's fingers tightened around hers for just an instant, a silent acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted between them in this cold room filled with dead men's secrets. We should go, Charlotte said carefully, her eyes moving between Elara and Dominic with barely concealed curiosity. Your father will be wondering where you've gone. Elara nodded, but didn't move. I need one more moment. Charlotte retreated, pulling the door partially closed, a compromise between chaperone duties and recognition that some conversations required privacy. 5 days, Elara said quietly, her eyes locked on Dominic's. In 5 days I become your duchess, your wife, your partner in whatever comes next. And you're certain? His voice carried an edge of vulnerability she'd never heard before. After everything you've learned, all the warnings, the accumulated evidence of my capacity for destruction, you're certain you can stand beside me? I'm not certain of anything, Elara admitted. Except that certainty is a luxury I can't afford. My family's survival depends on this marriage. But more than that, she paused, searching for words that felt true rather than convenient. I choose to believe that a man who has protected his mother's memory for 13 years at the cost of his own reputation is worth believing in, even if I'm wrong. And if you are wrong, Dominic asked, if I prove to be the monster after all, then I'll deal with that when it happens. She squeezed his hands once more, then released them, the absence of his warmth immediate and startling. But I won't live in fear of possibilities. I've spent too long being afraid already. She turned toward the door, then looked back. One more thing. I want to see Blackthorne Manor before the wedding. The estate, not this London house. I want to see where your father died, where your mother lived and suffered. I want to understand the geography of your past before I become part of your future. Dominic's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to identify. That's unconventional. So is marrying a man accused of murder, Elara pointed out. I think we've moved beyond conventional. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Tomorrow, then. We'll leave at dawn, spend the day there, return before evening. I'll send word to your father. Tomorrow. Elara agreed, and left before her courage could fail. The journey to Blackthorne Manor took 4 hours by carriage, cutting through countryside that grew progressively wilder as London's sprawl gave way to rolling hills and dense forest. Elara sat across from Dominic, Charlotte beside her as required by propriety, both women silent as the landscape transformed. Dominic had been right about one thing. Bringing Charlotte had been wise. Without her presence, the tension between bride and groom would have been suffocating. As it was, Charlotte's occasional observations about the scenery or questions about the estate provided enough distraction to make the journey bearable. But Elara barely heard her friends chatter. She was too focused on watching Dominic's face as they approached his ancestral home, the way his jaw tightened incrementally with each passing mile, the fingers that drummed against his knee in an uncharacteristic display of nervousness. He was dreading this, taking her to the place where his nightmares lived. "You don't have to do this," she said suddenly, breaking into one of Charlotte's observations about sheep farming. "We can turn back." "No." Dominic's voice was firm, but his eyes when they met hers held gratitude for the offer. "You were right to ask. If we're to build something real, you need to see all of me, even the parts I've kept locked away." The manor appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, a massive stone structure that seemed to grow from the earth itself, all gray granite and sharp angles, Gothic revival architecture that emphasized height and intimidation over comfort. Towers rose at each corner, their windows like dark eyes watching the approaching carriage. Ivy crawled up the walls in thick ropes, giving the impression that nature was slowly reclaiming what humans had built. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, like its owner. "Sweet mercy," Charlotte breathed. "It looks like something from a ghost story." "It practically is a ghost story," Dominic said dryly, though his attempt at humor fell flat. 3 centuries of Ravencroft history, most of it unpleasant. The carriage stopped in the circular drive before the main entrance. A small staff had assembled, butler, housekeeper, a handful of servants, all wearing expressions of barely concealed surprise. Clearly, the Duke didn't often visit, and certainly not with female guests. "Mrs. Blackwood," Dominic addressed the housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes. "This is Lady Elara Whitcombe, my betrothed. She'll require a tour of the manor, all of it." Mrs. Blackwood's eyebrows rose fractionally. "All of it, Your Grace? Even the—" "Especially the tower," Dominic said quietly. "Show her everything. Answer every question. I'll be in the study if needed." He turned to Elara, and in his face she saw the cost of this decision written clearly. "I can't accompany you. I haven't been to the tower since that night. But Mrs. Blackwood was here. She knows the truth. She'll tell you whatever you want to know." Before Elara could respond, he strode into the house, his posture rigid as a soldier marching toward a battle. Mrs. Blackwood watched him go with an expression that mixed pity and respect. "His Grace is a complicated man, Lady Elara, but a good one, despite what they say in London." She gestured toward the entrance. "Come, I'll show you why." The manor was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each more impressive and coldly beautiful than the last. Drawing rooms furnished with antiques worth fortunes, a library that rivaled anything Elara had seen, floor-to-ceiling books in multiple languages, a ballroom with chandeliers that would have cost more than her family's entire estate. But beneath the grandeur lay something else, an absence of warmth, of life, of anything suggesting humans had actually lived here rather than just existed. No family portraits smiled from the walls, no children's toys forgotten in corners, no signs of laughter or joy or any of the small evidences that made a house a home. "The late Duchess tried," Mrs. Blackwood said, as if reading Elara's thoughts. "She brought flowers, rearranged furniture, attempted to make it welcoming. But His Grace, the old Duke, he didn't tolerate changes, said the manor should remain exactly as his father had left it, as if preserving the past was more important than creating a future." They climbed stairs, moved through hallways, Charlotte trailing behind and growing progressively quieter as the tour continued. Finally, they reached a locked door at the base of the north tower. "This is it," Mrs. Blackwood said, producing a key that looked ancient. "The tower stairs. No one's been up since that night 13 years ago. His Grace, the current Duke, he ordered it sealed." "But you have a key," Elara observed. I keep keys to every lock in this house, Mrs. Blackwood said simply. It's my duty. Whether anyone chooses to use them is their decision. She unlocked the door, and it swung open with a groan of rusted hinges. Beyond lay a narrow stone staircase spiraling upward into darkness, lit only by narrow windows cut into the tower walls. The fight happened here? Elara asked, peering up into the gloom. At the top, my lady. The old Duke's private study was in the upper tower room. No one was allowed there, not servants, not the Duchess unless summoned, not young Master Dominic except when being disciplined. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth tightened. I use the word disciplined loosely. What happened in that room was torture, not discipline. Charlotte made a small sound of distress, but Elara felt only cold determination settling into her bones. Tell me everything. I need to know. Mrs. Blackwood looked at her for a long moment, assessing. Then she nodded. I was in the servants' quarters that night when I heard the screaming, the Duchess calling for help. I ran toward the sound along with 2 footmen. When we reached this doorway, we heard the fight above, shouting, crashing, the sound of violence. She paused, remembering. Then silence. Then a terrible sound, a body falling, hitting stone, over and over until it stopped. We ran up and found the old Duke at the bottom of these stairs, his neck at an impossible angle. The Duchess was at the top, holding young Master Dominic, both of them covered in bruises and blood. What did she say? Elara asked. She said she'd found her husband already fallen, that she'd called out when she discovered him, and Master Dominic had come running. She was very clear, very firm, made us all swear we'd tell that version to the magistrate. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes met Elara's directly. But we all knew what had really happened. The Duchess had finger marks on her throat. Master Dominic had a split lip and the beginning of a black eye. The old Duke's knuckles were bruised from hitting someone. You knew the truth, but you supported the lie, Elara said, not accusingly, but as simple observation. We supported the Duchess, Mrs. Blackwood corrected. She was a saint who'd endured hell for 20 years. If protecting her son's future meant lying to a magistrate, every one of us would have done it gladly. And we have. For 13 years, we've kept that secret. Charlotte spoke for the first time in minutes, her voice small in the tower's echoing space. Why didn't she just leave him? The old Duke, I mean. Why endure it? Women of her station don't leave, Mrs. Blackwood said with bitter practicality. Divorce is scandal. Separation means losing her children, her position, everything. She chose to stay and protect her son however she could, even if it meant sacrificing herself. Elara looked up the dark stairs, imagining a terrified woman and her 19-year-old son facing a monster in human form. She thought of Dominic's carefully controlled violence, the way he seemed always coiled for attack, not because he was dangerous by nature, but because he'd learned young that survival sometimes required swift, terrible action. Show me the rest, she said. They climbed. The stairs wound upward in a tight spiral, the stone worn smooth by centuries of feet. Narrow windows offered glimpses of the grounds below, forests and manicured gardens and the long drive leading back toward civilization. From this height, the manor looked even more like a fortress, or a prison. The study at the top was exactly as Mrs. Blackwood had described, frozen in time, preserved like a museum exhibit. A heavy desk dominated the space, its surface still covered with papers and correspondence yellowed by age. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on law and politics and hunting. A leather chair sat beside the cold fireplace, indented by the shape of the man who'd once claimed it. But what drew Elara's attention was the bloodstain on the floor near the desk, dark brown now, absorbed into the wood, impossible to remove, evidence of violence that no amount of scrubbing could erase. His Grace, the old Duke, he struck the Duchess here, Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. She fell, hit her head on the desk corner. Master Dominic heard her cry out from his room 2 floors below. By the time he reached her, the old Duke had her by the throat, slamming her head against the desk repeatedly, saying she'd disrespected him, questioned his authority, some trivial thing that enraged him. Mrs. Blackwood's voice remained steady, but her eyes glistened. Master Dominic pulled him off. They fought, really fought, not like the previous times when the boy would simply try to shield his mother. This time he fought back with everything he had. And when the old Duke came at him with a fire poker, Master Dominic pushed him away, The Duke stumbled toward the stairs, lost his balance, fell. And Dominic watched him fall, Elara said, remembering his words. Felt nothing but relief. Wouldn't you? Mrs. Blackwood asked. If you'd spent your whole life watching your mother beaten, terrorized, broken piece by piece, wouldn't you feel relief when the monster finally stopped breathing? Elara had no answer to that. She moved to the window and looked out over the estate, trying to reconcile this history of violence with the careful, controlled man who'd promised her honesty and partnership. The current Duke, she said slowly, he sealed this room to preserve his mother's secret, but also because he can't bear to face it himself. He carries guilt, Mrs. Blackwood confirmed. Not for killing his father. I don't think he regrets that for a moment. But for not protecting his mother sooner, for being too young, too weak to stop the years of abuse before that final night. That's not rational, Charlotte protested. He was a child for most of it. What could he have done? Guilt rarely is rational, Miss Fairfax. Mrs. Blackwood moved toward the door. But it shapes us nonetheless. His Grace became the man he is, hard, controlled, dangerous when threatened, because of what happened in this tower. He learned that sometimes violence is the only answer to violence, that protecting those you love requires being willing to do terrible things. They descended in silence, the weight of history pressing down on them with each step. When they emerged back into the manor's main floor, Elara felt as if she'd traveled through more than just physical space. She'd walked through the formation of the man she was about to marry, seen the crucible that had forged him. Thank you, she said to Mrs. Blackwood, for the truth. Thank you for asking for it, my lady. The housekeeper's stern expression softened slightly. His Grace needs someone who understands him, who can see past the reputation to the man beneath. I think perhaps you might be that person. I'm going to try, Elara said. Where is he now? The study, as he said. First floor, west wing. I can show you. I'll find it. Elara needed to walk, to think, to process everything she'd learned before facing Dominic again. She left Charlotte with Mrs. Blackwood and wandered through the manor's corridors, letting her feet carry her while her mind churned. She understood now why Dominic had become the monster London feared. When you grow up in a house where violence is the primary language, you learn to speak it fluently. When you watch someone you love destroyed piece by piece, you learn that power and control are the only protections against helplessness. But understanding didn't make it easier to accept. Dominic had killed his father. In self-defense, yes, in protection of his mother, true, but killed nonetheless. And he'd spent 13 years allowing the world to believe he was capable of anything, building a reputation so terrifying that no one would dare cross him the way his father had crossed decency and humanity. What kind of man did that make him, and what kind of woman did it make her that she'd chosen him anyway? She found the study by following the smell of wood smoke and brandy. The door stood ajar, and through the opening she saw Dominic standing by the window, exactly as he'd been in the London townhouse, still as stone, silhouetted against light, isolated even in his own home. He turned when she entered, and she saw the question in his eyes before he spoke it. Well, I saw it all, Elara said. The tower, the study, the bloodstain your staff couldn't remove. And his voice was carefully neutral, but tension radiated from every line of his body. And I understand now why you are what you are. She crossed the room until only a few feet separated them. You were forged in violence, Dominic, shaped by it, taught that control and power are the only shields against chaos. Yes, he didn't deny it, didn't try to soften the truth. Does that change your decision? No. The word came out stronger than she'd expected. But it clarifies something for me. You're not a monster, Dominic Ravencroft. You're a survivor, and there's a difference. Something cracked in his expression, relief or gratitude or something too complex to name. He reached for her hand, the gesture hesitant, asking permission rather than claiming right. Elara gave him her hand, felt his fingers close around hers with surprising gentleness. We're going to have to figure out how to live with this, she said quietly. How to build something new on a foundation of old violence. How to be partners when we're both still learning what that means. I know, Dominic said, and I know it won't be easy. But Elara, He paused, searching for words. Having you here, in this place, seeing all of it, and not running, it means more than I can express. Then don't try to express it, Elara said. Just show me. In the years ahead, show me that the man you've become is worthy of the chance I'm giving you. I will, he promised, and she believed him. They stood there, hands clasped, sunlight streaming through the study windows illuminating dust motes that danced between them like possibilities waiting to be realized. Outside, the manor's grounds stretched toward distant forests, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Just like the man who owned them. Just like the future they were about to build together. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late May, with all of London society watching. St. George's Church in Hanover Square overflowed with guests, peers and politicians, society matrons and scandal seekers, everyone who wanted to witness the moment the lamb married the wolf. The pews groaned under the weight of silks and jewels and barely concealed curiosity. Elara stood in the bride's chamber, staring at her reflection in the mirror while Charlotte made final adjustments to her veil. The dress was perfection. Madame Leclerc had outdone herself, but Elara barely saw it. She was too focused on the thundering of her own heart, the way her hands trembled despite her best efforts at composure. "You can still run?" Charlotte said softly, adjusting a pearl pin. "I brought a second cloak. We could slip out the side entrance, be on a ship to France before anyone noticed." "I'm not running." Elara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I made my choice. I know." Charlotte met her eyes in the mirror. "I just wanted you to know you had options, even now." "Thank you." Elara squeezed her friend's hand. "For everything, for standing by me through all of this, for not judging my decision." "Oh, I'm judging plenty," Charlotte said with a small smile. "But it's your life to live, not mine. I just hope he's worthy of what you're giving him." "So do I." A knock at the door. Her father, looking older than his years in formal dress, his face a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. "It's time, Elara." She took a breath, lifted her chin, and walked out to meet her future. The ceremony blurred into fragments, organ music swelling, hundreds of faces turning to watch her progress down the aisle, her father's trembling hand on her arm, and at the end of it all, Dominic waiting before the altar. He wore black, as always, but the severe color only emphasized the stark beauty of his features. When their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Hope, tentative and fragile, but real. The vicar began the service, words washing over her in waves. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." The familiar liturgy, ancient promises spoken by countless couples before them, but when Dominic repeated his vows, every word felt weighted with meaning beyond tradition. "I, Dominic Ravenscroft, take thee, Elara Whitcombe, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Love and cherish. He'd promised her honesty, protection, partnership, but never love. Yet hearing him speak those words in his careful, controlled voice, Elara felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The foundation upon which love might eventually build. Then it was her turn. "I, Elara Whitcombe, take thee, Dominic Ravenscroft." The words came easier than expected, strengthened by certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she'd face them rather than run. Rings exchanged, his family signet for him, a band of platinum and diamonds for her, joining the sapphire engagement ring. The weight of them felt like shackles and shelter in equal measure. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words echoed through the church, sealing fates and futures. Dominic lifted her veil with steady hands, and for just an instant before he leaned in, she saw vulnerability naked in his eyes. The fear that even now, even after everything, she might pull away. She didn't pull away. Their kiss was brief, proper, appropriate for the setting, but his lips were warm against hers, and his hand at her waist trembled slightly, and Elara understood that for all his reputation and control, he was as uncertain as she was about what they'd just committed to. The organ thundered into triumphal music. They turned to face the congregation as the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne, and Elara saw the reactions rippling through the crowd. Shock, pity, fascination, and in some faces, something that might have been envy. They processed down the aisle together, Dominic's arms solid beneath her hand, past faces that would dissect every moment for weeks to come, out into bright May sunshine where a crowd had gathered to see them emerge, and carriages waited to take them to the wedding breakfast. "Well," Dominic murmured as they descended the church steps, "we've done it. You're my Duchess now. No turning back." "No turning back," Elara agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. The breakfast passed in a blur of toasts and speeches and forced gaiety. Lord Whitcombe praised his new son-in-law with an enthusiasm fueled by profound relief that his debts were now paid. Various dignitaries offered congratulations that rang hollow, their eyes measuring the bride with pity and the groom with wariness. But there were genuine well-wishers too. Charlotte embraced Elara fiercely, whispering, "Write to me every week, promise." Mrs. Blackwood appeared briefly to curtsy to her new Duchess and offer a small approving nod. Even Caroline managed to look happy despite the whispers she'd undoubtedly heard. As evening approached, Elara felt exhaustion settling into her bones. Physical, emotional, the accumulated weight of weeks of doubt and decision culminating in this single day. "We should go," Dominic said quietly, appearing at her elbow. "The carriage is ready to take us to Blackthorne House." The London house, not the manor. Their first night as husband and wife would take place in the cold townhouse she'd visited before, in rooms that had witnessed decades of Ravencroft isolation. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only weary acceptance. This was her life now. Whatever came next, she would face it. They made their farewells and departed amid showers of rice and ribbons, the traditional celebratory chaos that accompanied newlyweds. The carriage pulled away from the celebration, carrying them toward their new reality. Silence settled between them, broken only by the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Dominic sat across from her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Are you frightened?" he asked finally. Elara considered the question honestly. "Yes, but not of you specifically. Of everything. Of the unknown." "I promised I would never force myself on you," Dominic said carefully. "That promise holds tonight and every night. Whatever happens between us will happen only when we both choose it." "Thank you." Relief loosened tension she hadn't realized she was holding. "For giving me that choice." They arrived at Blackthorne House as twilight descended over London. The butler greeted them with formal congratulations, and Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, showed Elara to rooms that had been prepared for the new Duchess. "His Grace's chambers are through that door," Mrs. Pemberton said, indicating a connecting door. "But it remains locked unless you choose otherwise, my lady. He was quite clear about that." Elara nodded, grateful for Dominic's continued consideration, even as part of her recognized the strangeness of beginning a marriage with locked doors between them. She dismissed the housekeeper and sat on the bed, a massive four-poster hung with deep blue velvet, and tried to process everything that had happened. She was a duchess now, a married woman, bound to a man she barely knew, for better or worse, until death. A knock at the connecting door made her start. "May I come in?" Dominic's voice muffled by wood. "Yes." He entered, still in his wedding clothes, though he'd removed the jacket and cravat. In shirt sleeves and waistcoat, he looked younger, less intimidating, almost approachable. "I wanted to check on you," he said, remaining by the door as if afraid to intrude further. "Today was overwhelming." "That's an understatement." Elara managed a weak smile. "I think half of London attended just to see if I'd run screaming at the altar." "I was half expecting you to," Dominic admitted. "Right up until you said, 'I do,' I thought you might change your mind." "Would you have let me? If I'd refused at the last moment?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "It would have destroyed your family's reputation, and mine. Would have been the scandal of the decade, but yes, I would have let you walk away if that's what you truly wanted." "Why?" Elara asked. "Why give me that power when you had everything to lose?" "Because forcing you would have made me exactly the monster they claim I am." He moved into the room but kept careful distance between them. "I've done many ruthless things, Elara, but I won't become my father. I won't take what isn't freely given." Something in his voice, The fierce conviction, the shadow of old pain, broke through her exhaustion. She stood and crossed to him, closing the distance he'd maintained. "We're married now," she said quietly. "Partners, as we agreed. That means we face things together, including this." She gestured around the room, encompassing everything: the house, the marriage, the uncertain future. "What are you suggesting?" Dominic's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes held cautious hope. "I'm suggesting we spend our wedding night talking, getting to know each other without the weight of London society watching, without warnings or rumors or anyone else's voices in our heads." She smiled tentatively. "Just two people trying to figure out how to build something real." Relief and gratitude flooded his expression. "I would like that very much." They settled into chairs by the fire, and for hours they talked, truly talked, about books and childhood memories and hopes for the future. Dominic revealed a dry sense of humor she hadn't seen before, a surprising knowledge of poetry, a love of horses and wild spaces. Elara shared stories of her mother, her struggles managing her father's household, her secret dream of writing novels, though ladies weren't supposed to harbor such ambitions. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion finally claimed them. Dominic stood, helping her to her feet, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Thank you," he said softly, "for today, for giving me a chance when no one else would." "Thank you for being worthy of it," Elara replied. He raised her hand to his lips, a gesture he'd done before, but this time it felt different, more intimate, more genuine. "Good night, Duchess," he said, and left through the connecting door. Elara stood alone in her new chambers, touching the place where his lips had pressed against her hand, and realized with equal parts terror and wonder that she was beginning to care for him. Really care, in ways that had nothing to do with obligation or survival. It should have frightened her more than it did. The next morning, everything shattered. Elara woke to pounding on her door and Charlotte's voice, high and frantic. "Elara, you need to see this, now!" She stumbled from bed, still in her nightgown, and opened the door to find Charlotte holding a newspaper, her face pale with shock. "What is it?" Elara asked, but Charlotte just thrust the paper at her, pointing to the front page. The headline hit like a physical blow. "Duchess of Blackthorne's husband exposed. New evidence suggests premeditated murder." Elara's vision narrowed to the words, her heart hammering as she read, "Anonymous sources have come forward with damning evidence against the Duke of Blackthorne. Letters written by the Duke's mother, allegedly describing her son's violent tendencies and her fear that he would one day do something irreversible. Medical records suggesting the late Duke's injuries were inconsistent with the simple fall. Testimony from servants claiming young Dominic Ravenscroft had threatened his father's life multiple times in the months before his death. Most damning, a letter allegedly written by the current Duke to a university friend, dated 2 weeks before his father's death, stating, "I pray daily for that man's demise. If no higher power will grant it, perhaps I must take matters into my own hands." The room spun. Elara gripped the doorframe to steady herself, rereading the words as if they might change meaning. "It's lies," she said, but her voice shook. "It has to be lies. Someone fabricated this." "Maybe," Charlotte said carefully. "But Elara, if this is published, true or not, it destroys everything. The scandal will be absolute. Questions will be raised about why the original investigation was closed so quickly. They'll reopen the case, and this time they might actually charge him with murder." Elara's mind raced. The letters from his mother, could they have been real? Could the woman who'd protected him have also documented her fears about him? The threat to his university friend, had Dominic actually written such words, never imagining they'd be used against him? Or was this exactly what it appeared to be? A calculated attack designed to destroy Dominic at the moment he'd finally found someone willing to stand beside him? "Where is he?" Elara demanded. "Does he know?" "In his study. He's been there since dawn, according to the servants." "Elara, what are you going to do?" But Elara was already moving, running through the corridors in her nightgown and bare feet, propriety abandoned. She burst into Dominic's study without knocking. He sat at his desk, the same newspaper spread before him, his face carved from ice. But his hands shook with barely contained rage. "It's the Duke of Westmont," he said without looking up. "It has to be. He's the only one with access to my mother's papers, or who could forge them convincingly enough. He's decided to destroy me completely, and he's timed it perfectly, right after our wedding, when pulling you into the scandal will hurt us both." "Are any of them real?" Elara asked, needing to know. "The letters, the threats, any of it?" Dominic finally looked at her, and his eyes held such pain that she nearly stepped back. "I don't know. My mother kept journals. I never read them after she died. Too painful. Westmont must have obtained them somehow. As for the letter to my friend," he closed his eyes briefly. "I was 19, angry, desperate. I may have written something foolish, but I never intended—" A crash from downstairs interrupted him, the sound of the front door slamming open, multiple footsteps, raised voices. They both ran to the hallway, looking down into the entrance hall where 3 men in official uniforms stood facing the terrified butler. "We're here for the Duke of Blackthorne," the lead man announced. "By order of the magistrate, he's to be taken into custody for questioning regarding the death of the late Duke 13 years past." The world stopped. Elara felt reality fracturing around her. Her husband of less than 24 hours about to be arrested for murder. The careful truth they'd built together collapsing under the weight of public accusation. Everything she'd chosen disintegrating before her eyes. Dominic's hand found hers, squeezing once. "I have to go with them." "No!" The word burst from her with surprising force. "No, I won't let them take you." "Elara, they have authority." "I don't care." She turned to face him fully, seeing the fear beneath his control. The certainty that this time, no amount of silence would save him. "You said we were partners, that we'd face things together. I'm not letting you face this alone." "Lady Elara, the Duchess," one of the officials corrected himself nervously. "Your husband is wanted for questioning. We must take him now." "Then you'll take me too," Elara said, lifting her chin. "Arrest me as an accessory if you must. But where he goes, I go." "That's not—" the official began. "I am the Duchess of Blackthorne," Elara interrupted, her voice carrying an authority she hadn't known she possessed. "My husband is a peer of the realm. You will afford him proper respect, and you will allow me to accompany him, or I will personally ensure that every legal protection available to his rank is brought to bear against this farce." The officials exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for resistance from a bride defending her husband. Dominic stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," Elara said firmly, "I do." Because in that moment she realized something crucial. The warnings, the doubts, the accumulated fears, none of it mattered as much as the simple truth that Dominic had been honest with her when he could have lied. He'd shown her his worst parts and given her the choice to refuse. He'd kept his promises even when it cost him. And if the world wanted to destroy him for defending his mother and himself, then the world would have to go through her first. "Get dressed," she told him. "Both of us. We're going to face this together." "And Dominic?" She squeezed his hand. "We're going to win." "Get dressed," she told him. "Both of us. We're going to face this together." "And Dominic?" She squeezed his hand. "We're going to win." For a heartbeat, Dominic simply stared at her, and Elara saw something shift in his expression, surprise giving way to something fiercer, more determined. He nodded once, sharp and decisive, then turned to the officials waiting below. "Give us 10 minutes, he called down, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who'd spent his life commanding rooms full of powerful men. "The Duchess and I will dress appropriately, and then we will accompany you. Attempt to enter our private chambers, and I will have you charged with unlawful trespass regardless of your warrants." The lead official opened his mouth to protest, caught the dangerous glint in Dominic's eyes, and apparently decided discretion was the wiser choice. 10 minutes, Your Grace. Not a moment longer." Elara and Dominic retreated to their respective chambers, though she left the connecting door open. A statement of unity that felt important even in this small way. She dressed with shaking hands, choosing a deep blue day dress that matched her sapphire engagement ring, arranging her hair with more care than speed required. If she was going to stand beside her husband while London tried to destroy him, she would look every inch the Duchess she'd become. When she emerged, Dominic was waiting, dressed in the same severe black he always wore, but his cravat was slightly askew. Without thinking, Elara reached up to straighten it, her fingers brushing the warm skin of his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for this, for not running when you had every reason to." "Stop thanking me for basic decency," Elara said, though her voice gentled. "You're my husband. Where else would I be?" Something flickered in his eyes, gratitude mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Most wives would have fled the moment the accusations went public, claimed they were deceived, sought an annulment, protected their own reputations. "I'm not most wives," Elara finished with his cravat and met his gaze directly. "And you're not most husbands. Now let's go show them exactly what they're dealing with." They descended the stairs together, Dominic's arm solid beneath her hand, presenting a united front to the nervous officials and the gathering crowd of servants. Charlotte had appeared, still in her nightgown but with a fierce expression that suggested she'd fight anyone who tried to separate them. "I'm coming too," Charlotte announced, as Lady Elara's, the Duchess's companion. "She needs a witness who isn't directly involved." "Miss Fairfax, this really isn't—" the lead official began. "Are you denying a Duchess her companion?" Charlotte interrupted, her merchant's daughter practicality cutting through protocol like a blade. "Because I'm quite certain that's not within your authority." The official sighed, clearly realizing he was outnumbered by determined women. "Fine, but we leave now." The carriage ride to the magistrate's office was silent, tension thick enough to choke on. Elara kept her hand clasped in Dominic's, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers that he couldn't quite control. He was terrified, she realized, not of the charges themselves, but of what this exposure meant. His mother's memory dragged through scandal, the secrets he'd protected for 13 years torn open for public consumption, everything he'd sacrificed rendered meaningless. "We'll get through this," she murmured, too low for the officials to hear. "Whatever it takes." "You don't know what you're promising," Dominic said, his voice barely audible. "Once this starts, once the investigation reopens, they'll dig into everything. My mother's journals, the servants' testimonies, every detail of that night. The truth will come out, all of it, and it will be ugly." "Then let it be ugly." Elara tightened her grip on his hand. "The truth is still better than allowing lies to destroy you." The magistrate's office was chaos, journalists crowding the steps, shouting questions the moment their carriage arrived. Elara glimpsed notebooks and sketching pads, heard her name and Dominic's being called out with varying degrees of respect and accusation. The officials had to physically clear a path, pushing back the press of bodies desperate for a story. Inside was hardly better. The waiting room overflowed with people. Lord Ashton looking grimly satisfied, Lady Victoria Ashford with tears streaming down her face, the Duke of Westmont standing tall and righteous in the corner, and dozens of others whose faces Elara recognized from society events, all here to witness the Duke of Blackthorne's fall. But something was wrong. As Elara's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she noticed another group standing apart from the accusers. Mrs. Blackwood, from Blackthorne Manor, 3 other servants she didn't recognize, and surprisingly, Lord Pemberton, a junior member of Parliament she'd met briefly at a dinner party weeks ago. Mrs. Blackwood caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity that sent relief flooding through Elara's chest. "The magistrate will see the Duke and Duchess now," an assistant announced, and they were ushered into a private office where Chief Magistrate Harrison sat behind a massive desk, looking deeply uncomfortable with the situation he'd been thrust into. Your Grace," he greeted them with proper deference, though his expression remained troubled. "I apologize for the necessity of this summons. However, given the serious nature of the accusations published this morning and the public outcry they've generated, I have no choice but to reopen the investigation into the late Duke's death." "I understand," Dominic said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his frame. "What do you require of me?" "Your testimony, first and foremost. And I must warn you, anything you say can and will be used in potential criminal proceedings. You have the right to legal counsel." "I don't need counsel," Dominic interrupted. "I'll tell you exactly what happened 13 years ago, every detail without omission, and when I'm finished, you'll understand why I've kept silent for so long." Magistrate Harrison looked startled. "Your Grace, I strongly advise—" "He won't be speaking alone," Elara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I was not present the night the late Duke died, but I have visited Blackthorne Manor. I have seen the tower room. I have heard testimony from servants who were there. And I have read the late Duchess's own words describing years of abuse at her husband's hands. The Duchess's journals are part of the evidence against, Harrison began. Then you've read them selectively, Elara interrupted, or whoever provided them to the press chose passages out of context. I want every page of those journals brought here. I want every servant who was present that night called to testify. And I want the Duke of Westmont to explain how he obtained private family documents that should have been sealed with the late Duchess's estate. Harrison's eyebrows rose. That's quite a demand, Your Grace. It's not a demand, it's a requirement for justice. Elara leaned forward, channeling every ounce of authority her new title provided. My husband has been tried and convicted in the press based on incomplete evidence and ancient grudges. If you're going to reopen this investigation, then do it properly. Examine everything, hear from everyone, and let the truth emerge fully rather than in convenient fragments. For a long moment, Harrison studied her. This young woman who'd been a duchess for less than a day, now commanding his office with surprising force. Then slowly he nodded. Very well. I'll issue summons for all relevant witnesses. The hearing will take place tomorrow, giving everyone time to prepare testimony. But Your Grace, he looked at Dominic, you should know. If the evidence suggests premeditated murder, I will have no choice but to order your arrest and trial. I understand, Dominic said, and I accept those terms. They were dismissed, escorted back through the crowd of onlookers whose reactions ranged from hostile to curious. But as they descended the steps, something unexpected happened. Lord Pemberton stepped forward, blocking their path. Elara tensed, expecting another accusation, but instead the young lord removed his hat and bowed deeply. Your Grace, he addressed Dominic formally. I wanted you to know, not all of us believe these accusations. Some of us remember your mother, what she endured, what you protected her from. He straightened, meeting Dominic's eyes directly. Tomorrow, when you testify, there will be voices speaking in your defense. You are not alone in this. Before Dominic could respond, Pemberton stepped aside, and others emerged from the crowd. Younger members of Parliament, a handful of society women who'd known the late Duchess, even two journalists who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the morning's sensational headlines. We want the truth, one of the journalists said, not the scandal that sells papers. Whatever happened that night, we'll report it fairly. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough to counter the tide of public opinion. But it was something, a crack in the unified wall of condemnation, proof that not everyone had already judged and convicted Dominic. Thank you, Dominic said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain. All of you. Your support means more than you know. They made it to their carriage, Charlotte still at Elara's side like a protective shadow. The moment the door closed and they were moving through London's streets, Dominic's careful control cracked. They're going to destroy everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My mother's memory, my father's reputation, deserved as his destruction might be, the Ravencroft name. Everything she tried to protect by staying silent. No, Elara said firmly. They're going to hear the truth. And the truth is that your mother was a victim, that you were a victim, and that what happened that night was justified defense of life against a violent monster. That's not scandal, Dominic. That's survival. Society doesn't see it that way, Dominic said bitterly. They see a son who killed his father, regardless of circumstances. They see what we show them, Elara interrupted. And starting tomorrow, we're going to show them everything. The beatings, the terror, the years of abuse. We're going to make them understand that the real monster died at the bottom of those stairs, and the real victim has been carrying guilt and shame for 13 years. Charlotte spoke for the first time since entering the carriage. She's right, Your Grace. The truth is your weapon now, not your burden. Let them see what really happened, and let society judge between a woman defending her life and a man defending his mother. Dominic looked between them. These two women who barely knew him but had chosen to stand beside him anyway, and something in his expression shifted. The resignation faded, replaced by determination. Then we prepare, he said. We gather every piece of evidence, every witness, every document that supports the truth. And tomorrow, we lay it all before the magistrate and dare them to call it murder. They spent the rest of the day in Dominic's study, surrounded by papers and memories. Mrs. Blackwood arrived within hours, bringing the servants who'd been present that night. 3 people now in their 50s and 60s who'd served the Ravencroft family for decades and remembered everything. "We've been waiting for this," Mrs. Blackwood said as she settled into a chair. The others arranged around the room. "For 13 years, we've carried the truth of what that man was, what he did. We kept silent because the Duchess asked it of us. But she's gone now, and you need us, so we'll speak." One by one, they told their stories. Thomas, the footman who'd heard the late Duke's rages echo through the manor countless times. Margaret, the lady's maid who'd helped the Duchess conceal bruises beneath powder and high collars. Robert, the butler who'd been dismissed by the old Duke for daring to intervene during one particularly violent episode, only to be rehired by Dominic the day after his father's death. "He was a demon," Margaret said bluntly, her elderly hands twisted together in her lap. "Forgive the language, Your Grace, but there's no other word for it. He'd be charming at dinner parties, then beat the Duchess unconscious the moment guests left. We all knew. We were all powerless to stop it." "Why didn't anyone report him?" Charlotte asked. "Surely there were authorities." "Authorities who answer to dukes?" Robert gave a bitter laugh. "A man of his rank and wealth? They'd have ignored any accusations, blamed the Duchess for provoking him, or worse, removed young Master Dominic from the house and left her completely at his mercy." "So we did what we could," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "We documented everything, kept records of the injuries, the frequency of attacks, the increasingly violent nature of his rages. The Duchess made us promise, if anything happened to her, if he finally killed her as we all feared he would, we'd have evidence to protect her son from being blamed." She produced a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This is our record. Dates, descriptions, even sketches of her injuries when they were particularly severe. The Duchess didn't know we were keeping it. We did it without her knowledge, wanting to protect both her and Master Dominic." Elara took the journal with trembling hands, opening it to random pages. What she found made her stomach turn: clinical descriptions of violence, dated entries spanning nearly 2 decades. A chronicle of systematic abuse that painted the late Duke of Blackthorne as exactly the monster his son had killed. "Why didn't you come forward before?" she asked. "When the newspapers published their accusations, when society was condemning Dominic, why wait until now?" "Because we weren't asked," Thomas said simply. "The original investigation was closed quickly, ruled an accident. We assumed that's what the Duchess wanted. Then Master Dominic sealed the tower and ordered us never to speak of that night. We thought he was protecting his mother's memory, so we honored that. But now the truth is being twisted," Margaret added, her voice strengthening with anger. "Now they're using the Duchess's own words, words torn from context, manipulated to make her son look like a murderer. And we can't stay silent anymore. We won't let them destroy what she died protecting." Dominic had been standing by the window throughout these testimonies, his back to the room, shoulders rigid with tension. Now he turned, and Elara saw his face was wet with tears he'd made no effort to hide. "I never asked you to carry this," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted anyone else burdened with these memories." "We carried it gladly, Your Grace," Mrs. Blackwood said gently, "because we loved your mother and we love you. Tomorrow, we'll tell the magistrate everything, and let society dare call it murder when they hear what really happened in that tower." A knock at the door interrupted them. The butler, looking harried. "Your Grace, there's a gentleman here demanding to see you. He says it's urgent regarding tomorrow's hearing. A Mr. Jonathan Ashford." The room fell silent. Ashford, the family Dominic had destroyed, whose youngest son had died. What could he possibly want now, except to twist the knife deeper? "Send him in," Dominic said, his voice hard. "Let's hear what other accusations he's come to deliver." But the man who entered wasn't Lord Ashton, the older brother Elara had met before. This was a younger man, perhaps 40, with grief etched into every line of his face. He carried a leather satchel and looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Your Grace," he said, his voice strained. "I'm Jonathan Ashford, James's eldest brother. I need to show you something that changes everything I thought I knew about my brother's death." He opened the satchel and withdrew a bundle of letters. their edges worn from repeated reading. After James died, I became the executor of his estate. I found these hidden in his study, locked in a box I only just managed to open. They're letters between James and the Duke of Westmont. Dominic's expression sharpened. Westmont? Read them, Jonathan said, holding them out with shaking hands. Read what they planned together, what Westmont convinced my brother to attempt, and understand that everything my family believed about you, everything we've hated you for, it was based on lies Westmont fed us. Elara took the letters and began reading aloud, her voice growing stronger with each damning line. They were a correspondence spanning months, chronicling a conspiracy between Westmont and James Ashford to destroy Dominic's reputation and claim the Blackthorne fortune through manipulation of debts and forged documents. My dear James, one letter began, written in Westmont's distinctive hand, you must trust me in this venture. Young Ravenscroft has no right to his father's title or wealth. He murdered the rightful duke, and I will see him hanged for it. But we need evidence that will force a new investigation, create the scandal, threaten exposure, and when Ravenscroft moves against you, we'll have proof of his violent nature to present to the authorities. Another letter, dated 2 weeks before James's death. Do not fear his retaliation. A man who kills his own father will eventually make a mistake that condemns him. Your sacrifice in this matter will be remembered, and your family will be compensated from the Blackthorne estate once I secure the title through legal channels. He used my brother, Jonathan said, his voice thick with fury and grief. Westmont convinced James that he was serving justice, exposing a murderer, helping our family reclaim honor. But really, Westmont just wanted the Blackthorne wealth for himself. He manipulated a foolish young man into becoming a pawn, then left him to die when the plan failed. Your brother's blackmail attempt, Dominic said slowly, understanding dawning. He wasn't acting alone. He was following Westmont's instructions. Every step of it, Jonathan confirmed. The forged letters claiming your mother had an affair, the threats to publish unless you paid him, all of it designed by Westmont to provoke you into the exact response that would make you look like a monster. And when you destroyed James financially instead of violently, when my brother couldn't live with the shame and guilt and took his own life, Westmont used that too. Turned our family's grief into another weapon against you. He met Dominic's eyes, his own red-rimmed and exhausted. My family has hated you for 5 years. We've called you a murderer, blamed you for James's death, dedicated ourselves to seeing you punished. But we were wrong. Westmont played us like puppets, and we were too blinded by grief to see it. Why come to me now? Dominic asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the shock that must be coursing through him. Why reveal this? Because this morning's newspaper article quoted Westmont extensively, praised him as a champion of justice, a man seeking truth about the late Duke's death. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. And I recognized his tactics. The way he's manipulating evidence, twisting words, building a narrative designed to destroy you, it's exactly what he did to James. And I realized that if I stayed silent, if I let him use my family's grief again to hurt you, then James's death would have been for nothing. He'd remain Westmont's victim forever. He took a shaking breath. So I'm here to testify tomorrow, to tell the magistrate about these letters, about Westmont's conspiracy, about how he's been orchestrating your destruction for years. It won't bring James back, but maybe it will stop Westmont from destroying anyone else. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Elara watched Dominic struggle with emotions too complex to name, vindication mixed with sorrow, anger at Westmont's manipulations tempered by grief for a young man who'd been used and discarded like a tool that had outlived its purpose. Thank you, Dominic finally said, his voice rough, for your courage in coming here, for choosing truth over vengeance. I'm not looking for your gratitude, Jonathan said. I'm looking for justice, real justice, not the perverted version Westmont sells. He turned toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Your Grace, I'm sorry. For the hatred, the accusations, the years of trying to destroy you. You were right to protect yourself from my brother's threats. I just wish someone had protected him from Westmont. After he left, the study fell into stunned silence. The servants looked at each other with grim satisfaction. Charlotte appeared both horrified and triumphant, and Elara felt pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "Westmont," she said slowly. "He's been orchestrating this entire campaign. The warnings I received, the confrontations, Lady Victoria's appearance at my dress fitting, he's been building toward this moment for years." "He was my father's closest friend," Dominic said, his voice hollow. "When my father died, Westmont was devastated. He believed the version of events my mother told the magistrate, but he never trusted it. He spent 13 years waiting for an opportunity to expose what he thinks is the truth, that I murdered my father in cold blood and escaped justice." "He doesn't know about the abuse," Mrs. Blackwood said. "The late Duke was too careful, too controlled in public. Westmont only saw the charming, powerful man, never the monster behind closed doors." "Then tomorrow we show him," Elara said, her voice cutting through the uncertainty. "We show everyone. Westmont wants to expose the truth? Fine. We'll give him truth, just not the version he's expecting." Chet. That evening, as night fell over London, Elara and Dominic stood together in his study, reviewing the mountains of evidence they'd assembled. Testimony from servants, the journal documenting abuse, Jonathan Ashford's letters proving Westmont's conspiracy, medical records Charlotte had somehow procured showing the late Duchess's repeated injuries. "It's enough," Charlotte said, looking over the organized stacks. "It has to be enough." "The question is whether the magistrate will allow it all," Dominic said. "Westmont has influence, connections. He could argue that much of this is irrelevant to the specific question of my father's death." "Then we make it relevant," Elara said. She'd been forming a plan throughout the day, pieces arranging themselves in her mind like a puzzle finding its solution. "We don't just answer the charges, we put Westmont himself on trial. Show his conspiracy, his manipulation of the Ashford family, his obsession with destroying you regardless of truth. Make the magistrate see that this isn't about justice, it's about one man's vendetta." "That's risky," Charlotte warned. "Attacking a Duke of Westmont's standing could backfire spectacularly." "So could staying silent while he destroys my husband," Elara countered. "Dominic has spent 13 years protecting his mother's memory at the cost of his own reputation. Tomorrow, we stop protecting anyone except the truth." Dominic looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude or respect, but something deeper, more profound. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "You know that?" "I'm terrified," Elara admitted. "But I'm also angry. At Westmont, at everyone who judged you without knowing the full story, at a society that protects monsters and condemns their victims. Tomorrow, I'm going to channel that anger into something useful." "We both are," Dominic agreed. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the magistrate decides. Thank you, Elara, for believing in me when no one else did. For standing beside me when running would have been safer and easier." "You're my husband," Elara said simply. "There's nowhere else I'd stand." They remained like that for a long moment, hands clasped, drawing strength from each other in the quiet study while London buzzed with speculation beyond the walls. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, revelation, and possibly destruction. But tonight, they had this: partnership forged in crisis, trust built on honesty, and the fragile hope that truth might actually matter more than reputation. The hearing began at 9 the next morning in Westminster Hall, a massive chamber that had witnessed centuries of British legal proceedings. The magistrate had clearly decided that given the public interest and the rank of those involved, this needed to be conducted with full ceremony and transparency. The gallery overflowed with spectators, journalists, peers, society matrons, and common citizens all jostling for space. Elara sat in the front row beside Charlotte, wearing a deep green dress that made her look older, more formidable. Dominic sat at the defendant's table, his posture perfect, his expression carved from ice. But Elara could see the slight tremor in his hands. Only she knew how terrified he was. Magistrate Harrison called the proceedings to order, and the chamber fell silent with anticipation. "We are here to reopen the investigation into the death of William Ravenscroft, Duke of Blackthorne, which occurred 13 years ago at Blackthorne Manor. New evidence has come to light suggesting the original ruling of accidental death may have been premature." He looked directly at Dominic. "Your Grace, you stand accused of premeditated murder. How do you answer?" Dominic rose, every eye in the chamber fixed on him. For a heartbeat, Elara saw him hesitate, the weight of 13 years of silence pressing down on him. Then he lifted his chin and spoke. I killed my father, but it was not murder. It was self-defense and defense of another, and I am prepared to prove it. A roar of reaction swept through the gallery. Harrison banged his gavel, calling for order, but Elara barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart. It had begun. The truth, after 13 years of silence, was finally being dragged into the light, and there was no going back now. The admission hung in the air like smoke after cannon fire, visible, tangible, impossible to ignore. Dominic remained standing, his gray eyes sweeping across the packed gallery with the same controlled intensity that had made London fear him for 13 years. But now, for the first time, Elara saw something else in that gaze. Defiance born not of arrogance, but of absolute conviction that the truth he was about to reveal would vindicate everything he'd sacrificed. Order! Magistrate Harrison's gavel cracked against wood repeatedly, fighting the roar of voices that had erupted. I will clear this chamber if necessary. Silence, all of you. Gradually, the chaos subsided into tense quiet. Harrison turned back to Dominic, his expression unreadable. Your Grace, you've just confessed to killing your father. I must warn you that anything further you say will be the complete truth, Dominic interrupted, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. Something I should have spoken 13 years ago, instead of allowing lies and speculation to define me. But I was honoring a promise to a woman who deserved better than the life she was given. Today, I break that promise, because the alternative is allowing her memory to be twisted into something it never was. He gestured to the defense table, where Mrs. Blackwood and the other Blackthorne servants sat alongside Jonathan Ashford. I have witnesses who will testify to years of systematic abuse. I have medical records documenting injuries that could only have come from repeated violence. I have journals kept by servants who feared they would one day find my mother dead by my father's hand. And I have the truth of what happened on the night William Ravenscroft, Duke of Blackthorne, fell to his death. Not by accident, not by premeditated murder, but by the desperate actions of a son protecting his mother's life. A figure rose in the gallery, the Duke of Westmont, his face flushed with rage. This is fantasy. William Ravenscroft was my closest friend, a respected peer, a man of honor and dignity. These accusations are nothing but the elaborate lies of a son trying to justify patricide. Sit down, Your Grace, Harrison said sharply. You will have your opportunity to speak. Right now the defendant has the floor. He turned back to Dominic. Proceed. But I warn you, this chamber will hear evidence, not theater. Every claim must be substantiated. It will be, Dominic said. He looked directly at Elara, and she saw the silent question in his eyes. Are you certain? Once this begins, we cannot stop it. She nodded, just once. A promise and a vow. Dominic took a breath and began. My father was two men. The one London knew, charming, educated, respected in Parliament and society. That man existed, but only in public. Behind the doors of Blackthorne Manor, William Ravenscroft was a tyrant who ruled his household through fear and violence, particularly toward my mother. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped lower, each word weighted with memory. The abuse began early in their marriage, a slap here, a shove there, always followed by apologies and promises it would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again, until apologies stopped, and it simply became the reality of her existence. These are serious allegations, Harrison said. Do you have proof beyond your own testimony? Call Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood to the stand, Dominic said. The elderly housekeeper rose and moved to the witness chair with dignified composure. After being sworn in, she looked directly at the magistrate, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I served the Ravenscroft family for 40 years, she began. I watched young William Ravenscroft grow up, saw him court and marry Lady Catherine, and witnessed the deterioration of that marriage into a nightmare. The late Duke was a violent man, Your Honor, not in public, never where anyone important could see, but in the privacy of his home. He was a monster. Can you provide specific examples? Harrison asked. Mrs. Blackwood didn't flinch. On March 15, 1799, I helped Lady Catherine conceal bruises on her arms and throat so she could attend a state dinner. On August 3rd, 1803, I called for the physician after the Duke pushed her down the main staircase, resulting in a broken wrist she was forced to claim came from a riding accident. On January 22nd, 1808, I found her unconscious in her chambers after he'd struck her head against a bedpost repeatedly because she'd questioned his treatment of their son. She reached into her reticule and produced the leather-bound journal Elara had seen the previous day. This contains dated records of every incident I witnessed or treated over 20 years. 47 separate occasions where Lady Catherine required medical attention or concealment of injuries, and those were only the ones I knew about. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Several women looked genuinely shocked, while others nodded with grim recognition. Apparently, domestic violence was an open secret among certain circles, spoken of in whispers, but never addressed publicly. "Why didn't you report these incidents?" Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Report to whom, Your Honor? The local magistrate who dined at the Duke's table monthly? The constabulary who relied on Ravenscroft patronage? The church leaders who praised his charitable donations?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice hardened. "Women in Lady Catherine's position have no recourse. Leaving means losing her children. Divorce means scandal that destroys her family. So she endured, and I documented, hoping that someday the truth would matter." "Objection!" The Duke of Westmont was on his feet again, his composure cracking. "This is character assassination of a man who cannot defend himself. William Ravenscroft was my friend for 30 years. I knew him intimately. He was incapable of such cruelty." "Then you didn't know him at all," Mrs. Blackwood said, turning to face Westmont directly. "Or perhaps you chose not to see what was plainly visible to anyone who cared to look. Lady Catherine wore high collars and long sleeves even in summer. She flinched when men raised their voices. She developed an expression, a kind of frozen wariness, that every woman who's lived with violence recognizes immediately. But you saw none of that, did you, Your Grace? Because seeing it would have required acknowledging that your friend was a monster." Westmont's face went purple with rage, but he had no response. He sat down heavily, and Elara felt a small surge of satisfaction. Mrs. Blackwood had just accomplished in minutes what might have taken hours of legal maneuvering. She'd put Westmont himself on trial, forcing him to confront his willful blindness. Harrison studied the journal Mrs. Blackwood had presented, his expression growing progressively darker as he turned pages. Finally, he looked up. "This is extensive and damning. Continue with your testimony, Mrs. Blackwood. What happened on the night of the Duke's death?" "I was in the servants' quarters when I heard Lady Catherine screaming," Mrs. Blackwood said. "Not unusual sounds of argument, but genuine terror. I ran toward the North Tower with 2 footmen. As we approached, we heard the fight, the Duke's voice, Master Dominic's voice, sounds of violence, then a terrible crash, and silence." Her voice wavered for the first time. "We found the Duke at the base of the tower stairs, his neck broken. Lady Catherine was at the top landing, bleeding from a head wound, with Master Dominic, just 19 years old, trying to support her weight while she sobbed. She told us she'd found her husband already fallen, that young Dominic had come running when she called for help. We knew immediately it was a lie, but we also knew it was the lie we needed to tell." "You committed perjury to protect a killer," Harrison said flatly. "We protected a victim," Mrs. Blackwood corrected, "and we'd do it again, every one of us." She stepped down, and Thomas the footman took her place, corroborating every detail. Then Margaret the lady's maid describing decades of concealing injuries and soothing a woman slowly being broken. Then Robert the butler explaining how he'd been dismissed years earlier for daring to intervene during a beating, only to be rehired the day after the old Duke's death. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence, building an undeniable picture of systematic abuse in a household that had lived in constant fear. By the time the 3rd servant finished speaking, several members of the gallery were openly weeping, and even Harrison looked shaken. "Your Grace," he addressed Dominic, "in light of this testimony, I want to hear your account of that night. In your own words, what happened in the tower?" Dominic stood, moving to the witness chair as if walking through deep water, every step requiring conscious effort. After being sworn in, he sat and finally allowed the carefully constructed walls to crack. "I was in my chambers reading," he began, his voice hollow with memory. "I heard my mother scream. Not the usual sounds I'd learned to ignore as a child. This was different, desperate. I ran toward the sound and reached the base of the North Tower stairs. The door was open. I could hear my father's voice above saying, he paused, swallowing hard, saying that this time he was going to finish what he'd started, that he was tired of her questioning him, tired of her judgment, tired of her very existence. I ran up the stairs, found him in his study, holding her by the throat, slamming her head against his desk repeatedly. There was already blood on the wood. She wasn't fighting anymore, just making these terrible choking sounds, her eyes rolling back. The chamber had gone absolutely silent. Even the journalists had stopped their frantic scribbling, transfixed by Dominic's confession. I grabbed him, pulled him off her. He turned on me and we fought, really fought, not like the previous times when I'd tried to shield her and he'd beaten me for interfering. This time I was bigger, stronger, old enough to actually fight back. He came at me with a fire poker. I pushed him away with everything I had. He stumbled backward toward the staircase, lost his balance, fell. Dominic's voice broke. I watched him fall, heard every impact as he hit the stairs, saw his body twist and land at the bottom, and I felt nothing but relief that he couldn't hurt her anymore, that it was finally over. Did you intend to kill him? Harrison asked quietly. No, I intended to stop him, to protect my mother. If he'd survived the fall, I would have called for the physician and faced whatever consequences came. But he didn't survive. And my mother... He looked up and tears tracked openly down his face. She made me promise never to tell the truth, said she'd already lost her husband. She wouldn't lose her son to scandal or execution. She wrote a confession explaining everything, locked it away with instructions it only be opened if I was ever formally charged with murder. Then she told the magistrate she'd found him already fallen, and I supported that lie because honoring her wishes mattered more than my reputation. Where is this confession now? Harrison demanded. Dominic gestured to Elara. My wife has it. She's the only person I've ever shown it to. All eyes turned to Elara as she rose and approached the bench, carrying the bundle of letters Dominic had revealed to her that day in his study. Harrison took them with careful hands, breaking the seal and reading while the entire chamber waited in breathless silence. Minutes passed. Harrison read one letter, then another, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock to something approaching horror. Finally, he looked up at Dominic. This is your mother's handwriting? It is. Authenticated by the family solicitor, who can be called to verify if necessary. Harrison held up one particular page. She describes in detail the night of her husband's death, says explicitly that her son acted in defense of her life, that she instructed him to support her false testimony, that she would swear before any authority that the death was accidental rather than see her son punished for saving her. He lowered the letter. This is extraordinary, and it directly contradicts every implication in the newspaper articles accusing you of premeditated murder. Because those articles were based on selective excerpts from her journals, Dominic said, passages taken out of context and manipulated to create a narrative of me as dangerous and violent, while omitting every entry describing my father's abuse. And who provided those excerpts to the press? Harrison asked, though his gaze had already shifted to where Westmont sat, looking increasingly cornered. Before Westmont could respond, Jonathan Ashford stood. If I may, Your Honor, I have evidence directly relevant to that question. Harrison nodded, and Jonathan approached the bench with his satchel of letters. These are correspondence between the Duke of Westmont and my late brother James, documenting a conspiracy to destroy the current Duke of Blackthorne through manipulation of evidence and public opinion. He laid out the letters one by one, and as Harrison read them, his expression darkened considerably. When he finally looked up at Westmont, his voice carried genuine anger. Your Grace, did you obtain Lady Catherine's journals from her sealed estate? Westmont stood, his composure finally shattering completely. I obtained them legally, as executor of William Ravencroft's will. They were my friend's property, and I had every right to selectively edit them and provide them to the press? Harrison interrupted. To orchestrate a campaign of character assassination against the current Duke? To manipulate a grieving family into attacking an innocent man? He held up Jonathan's letters. These documents suggest you've been attempting to destroy the Duke of Blackthorne for years, using any method necessary. Is that accurate? He killed my friend! Westmont's voice rose to a shout, all pretense of dignity abandoned. He murdered William in cold blood and escaped justice through lies and manipulation. I've spent 13 years gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the opportunity to expose him. And yes, I used every resource at my disposal, because someone had to seek justice for a man who couldn't seek it himself. Justice? Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. She'd risen from her seat, her elderly frame trembling with fury. You want to speak of justice, Your Grace? Where was justice for Lady Catherine during 20 years of beatings? Where was justice when she begged your help one evening at a dinner party? I was there. I heard her. And you told her that supporting one's husband in all things was a wife's duty? Westmont's face went pale. I never... You did. June 16th, 1809. She had bruises on her wrists that she couldn't quite hide, and you saw them, and you chose to believe her ridiculous story about a carriage door rather than acknowledge what was plainly obvious, because acknowledging it would have required you to confront the fact that your dear friend was a monster, and that was more uncomfortable than letting a woman suffer in silence. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped. Shock, agreement, denial, until Harrison's gavel brought a semblance of order. That's enough, he declared. I've heard sufficient testimony. Your Grace, he addressed Westmont with cold formality, you will surrender all of Lady Catherine's journals and any other Ravencroft family documents in your possession immediately. Furthermore, I am referring your conduct to the Lords for investigation into possible abuse of executorship privileges and conspiracy to pervert justice. Westmont staggered as if physically struck. You cannot. I am a peer of the realm, and you have abused that position to pursue a vendetta, Harrison said flatly. Guards, escort the Duke of Westmont from this chamber. He will take no further part in these proceedings. As Westmont was led away, still protesting his righteousness, Elara felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. The man who'd orchestrated so much of Dominic's suffering, who'd weaponized grief and twisted truth into lies, was finally facing consequences. But Harrison wasn't finished. He turned back to Dominic, his expression softer now but still grave. Your Grace, the evidence presented today paints a clear picture of a young man acting in defense of his mother's life against an abusive father. Under the law, such action constitutes justifiable homicide, not murder. However, you and several witnesses did commit perjury in the original investigation by providing false testimony. Dominic stood straight, accepting whatever judgment was coming. I understand, Your Honor. I'm prepared to face those consequences. Harrison studied him for a long moment. Under normal circumstances, perjury carries serious penalties. However, given the extraordinary circumstances, a victim of abuse protecting her son, servants protecting their mistress, and a legal system that offered no genuine recourse for a woman in Lady Catherine's position, I am inclined toward leniency. He paused, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. It is the judgment of this court that the death of William Ravencroft, Duke of Blackthorne, was the result of justifiable actions taken in defense of another's life. All charges against Dominic Ravencroft, current Duke of Blackthorne, are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, this court apologizes to the Duke for the failure of the legal system to protect his mother during her lifetime, and for the years of suspicion and scandal he has endured as a result of honoring her final wishes. The chamber exploded into chaos, cheers from some sections, outraged protests from others, journalists racing for the doors to be first with the story. But Elara heard none of it. She was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward where Dominic stood, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. She reached him, and his arms came around her automatically, pulling her close as if she were the only solid thing in a world gone liquid with relief and vindication. It's over, she whispered against his chest. Dominic, it's finally over. Because of you, he said, his voice rough. If you hadn't stood beside me, hadn't demanded the truth be heard fully. We did it together, Elara corrected, like partners. He pulled back enough to look at her, and in his eyes she saw not just gratitude or relief, but something deeper, something that looked remarkably like the beginnings of love. Together, he agreed, and kissed her. It wasn't the chaste kiss they'd shared at their wedding, performed for public consumption. This was real, desperate and grateful, and full of promise for everything they might build now that the past had finally been laid to rest. When they broke apart, the chamber was still in chaos, but Elara noticed something. Lord Pemberton was applauding, and others were joining him, not just the young progressives, but older peers, society women, even some of the journalists. Recognition that what they'd witnessed wasn't scandal, but survival. Not murder, but justice finally served 13 years late. Mrs. Blackwood appeared at their side, her stern expression softened by tears. "Well done, Your Grace. Both of you. Lady Catherine would be proud." "Thank you," Dominic managed, "for everything. For carrying that burden all these years, for speaking the truth when I couldn't." "We served her until her last breath," Mrs. Blackwood said simply, "and we'll serve you and your Duchess with the same loyalty, because you've proven yourself worthy of it." The days that followed brought a peculiar kind of chaos. London society, which had spent 13 years treating Dominic as a dangerous enigma to be feared and avoided, suddenly couldn't decide whether he was a tragic hero or a fascinating scandal. Dinner invitations flooded Blackthorne House. Ladies who'd crossed the street to avoid him now angled for introductions. Men who'd whispered warnings about the Wolf of Blackthorne now praised his filial devotion and courage. "They're insufferable," Charlotte observed one afternoon, helping Elara sort through the mountain of calling cards and invitations. "Half these people were convinced you'd married a murderer 3 weeks ago. Now they want to claim they always believed in him." "Let them claim whatever makes them feel righteous," Elara said, setting aside yet another invitation to a society event she had no intention of attending. "The truth is out. That's what matters." "The truth has certainly caused interesting reverberations," Charlotte agreed. "Did you see the editorial in the Times this morning? Calling for reforms in laws governing domestic abuse, suggesting that women need better legal protections. Your husband's case has apparently sparked a movement." Elara had seen it. She'd also seen the counter-editorials arguing that airing such private family matters publicly was unseemly, that strong men were needed to maintain household order, that questioning a husband's authority over his wife would lead to social chaos. The battle would be long, but at least it was finally being fought openly, rather than in whispers behind closed doors. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The butler entered, looking slightly flustered. "Your Grace, Lord Ashton is here requesting an audience. I told him you weren't receiving, but he insists it's urgent." Elara and Charlotte exchanged glances. Lord Ashton, the older brother who'd warned Elara away from Dominic, whose family had been destroyed by the feud with Westmont. "Show him in," Elara said, curious despite herself. Lord Ashton looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. His face was haggard, his clothes less immaculate than she remembered. He bowed deeply to Elara, his usual arrogance completely absent. "Your Grace, thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to your time after everything." "Sit," Elara said, not unkindly. "Say what you came to say." Ashton sat on the edge of a chair, his hands twisting together nervously. "I came to apologize. To you, to the Duke, to anyone who will listen. My family was wrong. We blamed your husband for my brother's death, dedicated years to seeing him punished, allowed our grief to be weaponized by Westmont, and all of it was based on lies." "You didn't know," Elara said carefully. "Westmont manipulated you expertly." "That's no excuse. I should have questioned, investigated, demanded actual evidence rather than accepting convenient narratives that fit my anger." He looked up, and his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion, or tears, or both. "When Jonathan showed me those letters, when I understood what Westmont had done to James, using him, discarding him, letting him die believing he was serving justice, I realized I'd spent 5 years hating the wrong man. And I don't know how to live with that." Elara felt sympathy stir despite everything. "You live with it by choosing differently going forward, by speaking truth when you encounter other situations where the convenient narrative might be hiding something darker. By remembering that grief, however legitimate, doesn't justify cruelty." "Wise words from one so young," Ashton said with a ghost of a smile. "Your husband is fortunate to have found you." "We found each other," Elara corrected, "in rather dramatic circumstances, but found each other nonetheless." After Ashton left, Elara sat in the quiet drawing room and realized with a start that she was happy. Genuinely, unexpectedly happy. The past weeks had been terrifying, exhausting, filled with more drama than she'd ever imagined experiencing. But they'd also been transformative. She'd discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. She'd stood before the most powerful people in England and refused to be intimidated. She'd fought for someone she believed in and won. And somewhere in the process, the marriage that had begun as a transaction had transformed into something real. "There you are." Dominic's voice from the doorway made her smile. He'd been meeting with his solicitors, finalizing the legal aftermath of the hearing. "I've been looking for you." "I've been here, drowning in invitations from people who want to pretend they were always on our side." Dominic crossed to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, a casual intimacy they'd been discovering in small increments since the hearing. "We could accept a few. Show London that we're not hiding, that we have nothing to be ashamed of." "Or we could go to Blackthorne Manor," Elara suggested, "away from the city, the gossip, the endless social performances. Just the two of us, learning to actually be married rather than constantly defending our right to exist." Dominic's expression softened. "I'd like that. The manor needs, reclaiming. It's been a place of ghosts and sorrow for too long. Perhaps it's time to make it something else." "A home," Elara said. "A real one, built on truth rather than secrets." "With you," Dominic added, taking her hand. "I don't think I've properly thanked you for what you did, standing beside me when you could have fled, demanding truth when silence would have been easier, fighting for me when I'd almost given up fighting for myself." "You've thanked me approximately 47 times, Elara said with a smile. "I'm keeping count. Besides, you would have done the same for me." "I would," Dominic agreed. "But Elara," he paused, seeming to struggle with words, "I need you to know that somewhere in the past weeks, this marriage stopped being an arrangement and became more real, important in ways I never expected." Alara's heart stuttered. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I love you," Dominic said simply. "I didn't intend to. I promised you honesty and partnership, not romance. But you made it impossible not to love you, your courage, your loyalty, your refusal to accept convenient lies when the truth mattered. You saved me, Elara, not just from scandal or imprisonment, but from the isolation I'd built around myself for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to truly be seen." Elara felt tears pricking her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from joy rather than pain. "I love you too. I think I started falling the moment you gave me the choice to refuse, even knowing what it would cost you. You could have been the monster they claimed, but instead you were just a complicated man trying to honor impossible promises." "Not so complicated anymore," Dominic said, pulling her close. "Thanks to you, I'm finally just myself. No masks, no secrets, no walls. Just a man who loves his wife and wants to build a future worth living." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while London continued its endless noise beyond the windows. The scandal would fade eventually. The gossip would move on to newer, more interesting targets. But what they'd built together, trust forged in crisis, love discovered through trial, that would endure. 1 year later, Elara stood in the renovated nursery at Blackthorne Manor, watching snow fall across the grounds through windows that had been cleaned of years of grime and neglect. The entire estate had been transformed over the past months. Dark rooms opened to light, oppressive furnishings replaced with comfortable elegance, gardens that had gone wild brought back to cultivated beauty. But the most significant transformation was in the man who stood beside her, their newborn son cradled carefully in his arms. "He has your eyes," Dominic said softly, gazing down at the sleeping infant. "Storm gray, just like mine. I hope that's where the resemblance ends." "He has your strength too," Elara said, touching their son's tiny fist. "And he'll grow up in a house without violence, without secrets, without the shadows that haunted his father. That's your gift to him, breaking a cycle that could have continued for generations." Dominic looked up at her, and she saw in his face something she'd never seen in those early days. Peace. Real, genuine peace, the kind that came from no longer carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. "I've been thinking," he said, "about my mother, about what she endured, about all the women who suffer in silence because the law and society offer them no protection. And, Elara prompted, recognizing the thoughtful expression that meant he was working through something important. I want to establish a foundation in her name, something that provides legal assistance, safe housing, financial support for women trying to escape abusive situations. Use the Ravencroft wealth and influence to create the protection she never had. Elara felt pride swell in her chest. That's brilliant, and long overdue. You could fund it through the estate proceeds, work with Parliament to reform the laws. We could fund it, Dominic corrected. This isn't just my project, Elara. We're partners, remember? Your voice, your vision, your stubborn refusal to accept injustice, all of that is essential. Partners, Elara agreed, the word still feeling new and precious even after a year of living it. In everything. Their son stirred, making small sounds that suggested he'd wake soon and demand feeding. Dominic carefully transferred him to Elara's arms, his movements practiced now after weeks of late-night feedings and diaper changes. Do you ever regret it? Dominic asked quietly. That morning, you found the newspaper article, when you could have walked away and saved yourself from all of this? Elara looked down at her son. This tiny person who existed because she'd chosen courage over fear, truth over convenient fiction. She thought of the past year, the challenges and triumphs, the way she and Dominic had learned to truly know each other without the weight of secrets pressing down on them. Not for a single moment, she said. Choosing you was the best decision I ever made, even when it was terrifying, especially because it was terrifying. You're remarkable, Dominic said, echoing his words from that night before the hearing. But now they carried different weight, not just gratitude or surprise, but deep knowledge of who she was and love for all of it. So are you, Elara replied. A man who chose honor over comfort, truth over reputation, love over isolation. The world saw a monster, but I saw you, all of you, and I wasn't afraid. Thank you, Dominic said, pulling her close, so the three of them formed a small circle of warmth against the winter cold outside. For seeing me. For staying, for building this with me. Outside, snow continued to fall across Blackthorne Manor's grounds, covering the dark stones with pristine white. A visual metaphor so perfect it might have been scripted. But it wasn't metaphor. It was simply winter, the natural cycle of seasons turning, old giving way to new. Inside, in a nursery painted in soft blues and filled with light, a family that shouldn't have existed began writing their own story. Not one defined by scandal or tragedy, but by the simple truth that sometimes courage means standing beside someone when the world insists you should run. And sometimes the monster everyone fears is just a man who's been protecting something precious at enormous cost to himself. Elara had married the Wolf of Blackthorne, expecting a transaction, a duty, a sacrifice for her family's survival. Instead, she'd found a partnership that transformed them both. She'd discovered that true strength wasn't in accepting the world's verdict without question, but in demanding evidence and choosing based on your own judgment. She'd learned that legends could be rewritten if you were brave enough to speak the truth loudly enough that it drowned out the comfortable lies. And most importantly, she'd learned that love, real love, the kind worth fighting for, wasn't found in fairy tale romance or perfect courtship. It was forged in fire, tested by crisis, and proved through the choice to stand together when standing alone would have been so much easier. Years later, when their son was old enough to ask about his father's reputation and the whispers that still occasionally followed the Blackthorne name, Elara would tell him the truth. All of it. The violence and the valor, the secrets and the sacrifice, the way sometimes doing the right thing means breaking rules that were designed to protect the guilty rather than the innocent. She would teach him that a man's character isn't defined by what people say about him, but by the choices he makes when those choices cost him everything. And she would tell him about his grandmother, Lady Catherine Ravencroft, who endured decades of hell so her son might have a chance at a better life, who made the ultimate sacrifice of allowing her own suffering to remain hidden so that her child might be protected from consequences he didn't deserve. That legacy of choosing love over comfort, of protecting the vulnerable at personal cost, of refusing to become the monster even when you've been victimized by one. That was what the Blackthorne name would mean going forward. Not fear, not scandal, not whispered warnings, but courage. truth, and the transformative power of being seen, truly seen, by someone brave enough to look past the legend to the man beneath. As Elara rocked their sleeping son and watched Dominic add logs to the nursery fire, ensuring warmth against the winter night, she felt profound gratitude for the newspaper article that had shattered their brief peace. It had forced truth into light. It had compelled Dominic to finally speak the secrets he'd carried alone for so long. And it had given them the opportunity to choose each other, not out of obligation or transaction, but out of genuine understanding and love. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest gifts come wrapped in the ugliest packaging. Sometimes the wolf at your door is actually the prince who's been cursed by circumstances beyond his control. And sometimes, all it takes to break a curse is one person willing to say, "I see who you really are, and I'm not afraid." The snow fell, the fire crackled. Their son slept peacefully in a house that had been cleansed of its ghosts and transformed into something new. And in that moment, as Dominic crossed to kiss her forehead and stroke their child's soft hair, Elara understood that this ordinary evening in an extraordinary life they'd built from the wreckage of scandal and accusation, this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic vindication or public celebration, just love, just partnership, just the quiet knowledge that they'd faced the worst the world could throw at them and emerged not just intact, but stronger, together, always together. And that, she thought, as contentment settled into her bones like warmth from the fire, was enough. It was everything.